The Boeing 767 shuddered violently at 37,000 feet, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. In row 24, Malik Carter's eyes snapped open as the oxygen masks dropped from above. His daughter Nia screamed, clutching his arm. Around them, chaos erupted, crying, praying, panic spreading like wildfire through the darkened cabin. Then came the announcement that changed everything. If there is anyone on board with commercial or military flight experience, please identify yourself immediately. Malik's heart stopped. 5 years. 5 years since he'd touched a yoke. 5 years since he'd sworn never again. But now, looking at his terrified daughter, he knew that promise was about to break. Before we continue, I want to invite you to follow this story all the way to the end. If you're enjoying it, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Malik's story. 12 hours earlier, Malik Carter had been standing in Terminal 3 at JFK International Airport, watching his daughter press her nose against the massive windows overlooking the tarmac. The morning sun painted the aircraft in shades of gold and silver, and Nia's eyes were wide with wonder. "Daddy, is that our plane?" she asked, pointing at a massive, wide-body jet being serviced by a swarm of ground crew. "Not quite, baby girl," Malik said, crouching down beside her. "Ours is over there, the smaller one." Nia turned to look where he pointed, then back at the larger aircraft. "Why can't we take the big one?" Malik smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because the big one costs more than Daddy makes in 6 months. She considered this with the serious expression of a 7-year-old trying to understand adult economics. Then she slipped her small hand into his. "That's okay. I bet ours is faster." "You know what? I bet you're right." The truth was, this trip had taken every spare dollar Malik had saved over the past 2 years. 2 years of double shifts at the warehouse. 2 years of saying no to new shoes for himself so Nia could have the ones with the characters she loved. 2 years of rice and beans for dinner more nights than he cared to count. But he'd promised her. When her mother left, just walked out one Tuesday morning, like she was going to the grocery store and never came back, Nia had cried herself to sleep for weeks. And in one of those dark nights with his daughter's tears soaking through his shirt, Malik had whispered a promise. "One day, baby girl, I'm going to take you somewhere amazing, just you and me. I promise." Well, now, standing in this airport with 2 budget tickets to Reykjavik in his pocket and a daughter who couldn't stop smiling, Malik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite happiness. The weight he carried was too heavy for that. But maybe hope. Maybe that was enough. "Come on," he said, shouldering his worn backpack. "Let's get through security before the line gets crazy." The security checkpoint was already backed up, families with mountains of luggage creating bottlenecks, while TSA agents barked instructions in voices worn thin by repetition. Malik kept Nia close, one hand on her shoulder as they shuffled forward in line. Around them, the morning airport crowd hummed with a particular kind of chaos. Excited honeymooners, stressed business travelers, a college kid who'd clearly rolled straight from a party to catch a red-eye. "Sir, remove your laptop," a TSA agent called out. "I don't have a laptop," Malik said. The agent looked at his backpack skeptically. "What's in the bag?" "Clothes, a book, some snacks for my daughter." "Open it." Malik did, knowing what the agent would see. 3 changes of clothes rolled tight to save space, a paperback thriller from the library, a Ziploc bag of goldfish crackers, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a towel to keep it safe, a small photo album. The agent rifled through it all with practiced efficiency, pausing only when she reached the album. "What's this?" "Pictures," Malik said, "for the trip." She opened it, and Malik saw her expression soften slightly as she flipped past photos of Nia as a baby, Nia's first day of school, Nia blowing out birthday candles. The agent closed the album and handed it back without a word. "You're good to go." At the gate, they had 45 minutes before boarding. Nia wanted to explore every corner of the terminal, but Malik's energy was already flagging. He'd worked a 12-hour shift the night before, stocking shelves until his back screamed and his feet went numb. His supervisor had tried to make him stay for overtime. "We're short-staffed, Carter, I need you." But for once in his life, Malik had said no. His daughter came first. This trip came first. They found seats near the windows, and Nia immediately pulled out the small notebook Malik had bought her for the trip. She'd been filling it with drawings for weeks. Imaginary scenes of Iceland with its volcanoes and waterfalls and horses, all rendered in crayon with the earnest imperfection of a child's hand. "Do you think we'll see the northern lights?" she asked, not looking up from her drawing. "Maybe," Malik said, "if we're lucky." "Daddy, do you believe in luck?" It was the kind of question that could break your heart if you let it. Malik looked at his daughter, this small, perfect person who'd been dealt a pretty rough hand so far and still managed to see magic in the world, and felt something crack in his chest. "I believe in trying," he finally said, "and I believe that sometimes, if you try hard enough, good things happen. Maybe people call that luck." Nia nodded, satisfied with this answer, and went back to her drawing. Malik leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes, just for a moment. He didn't mean to fall asleep, but the exhaustion pulled him under like a tide. In his dreams, he was back in the cockpit of a different plane, the instruments glowing in the darkness, his hands steady on the controls. In his dreams, he still belonged to the sky. "Daddy, wake up! They're boarding!" Malik jerked awake to find Nia shaking his arm, her face bright with excitement. Around them, passengers were lining up at the gate, a slow shuffle of humanity dragging roller bags and checking boarding passes. "We're in Group 4, Nia announced, having memorized their boarding group the moment they'd checked in online. "That's right, baby girl. We wait until they call us." Group 1 passed, then Group 2, business travelers in expensive suits, families who'd paid for priority boarding, a couple who looked like they flew every week of their lives. Malik watched them disappear down the jet bridge and felt the familiar weight of not quite belonging. He'd spent enough time in airports in his old life to know the unspoken hierarchy. Back then, he'd been the one boarding first. Back then, he'd been the one walking past everyone else to get to the cockpit. "Group 4, please approach the gate." Nia grabbed his hand and practically dragged him into line. The gate agent scanned their passes with a bored expression, and then they were moving down the jet bridge, that strange liminal space between terminal and aircraft. "Sir, you're in row 24, a flight attendant said as they stepped onto the plane. "Toward the back." "Thank you." They navigated the narrow aisle, Nia's eyes taking in everything, the overhead bins, the emergency exit signs, the way sunlight streamed through the small windows. Other passengers were settling in, stowing bags, arguing over armrests, trying to find space in bins that were already full. Row 24 was deep in economy, 2 seats together on the right side of the aircraft. Malik hoisted their backpack into the overhead compartment and guided Nia to the window seat. She pressed her face against the glass immediately. "I can see the wing," she exclaimed. "That's right. If you watch real close during takeoff, you'll see it flex." "The wing moves?" "Just a little. It's supposed to. Means it's working." A businessman in a rumpled suit squeezed past them to reach the aisle seat, giving Malik a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man immediately pulled out his laptop and a file folder stuffed with papers, creating a small fortress of work around himself. The boarding process dragged on. More passengers, more bags, more delays. A family with 3 small children settled in the row ahead of them, the kids already whining about being hungry, being bored, needing the bathroom. Malik felt a headache starting to bloom behind his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're still waiting for a few more passengers and finalizing our weight and balance calculations," a voice announced over the PA system. "We anticipate pushing back from the gate in approximately 15 minutes. Nia looked at Malik with concern. "Is something wrong with the plane?" "No, baby. They're just making sure everything's perfect before we take off. That's their job, to keep us safe." "Were you ever a pilot, Daddy?" The question hit him like a fist to the solar plexus. Malik had never told Nia about his previous life, never explained why he worked at a warehouse when he had a degree in aeronautical engineering and thousands of flight hours in his logbook. She knew her father worked hard. She knew money was tight, but she didn't know that once upon a time he'd commanded aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She didn't know about the accident, the investigation, the way everything had fallen apart. "Once," he said quietly, "a long time ago." "Why did you stop?" "Life got complicated, baby girl." She seemed to accept this, turning back to the window. But Malik could see the wheels turning in her small head, processing, wondering. He made a mental note to change the subject next time. Finally, the cabin door closed with a heavy thunk. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, pointing to exits and demonstrating how to fasten a seatbelt with the kind of choreographed precision that comes from doing the same routine 1,000 times. Malik noticed one of them, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, watching the cabin with an intensity that suggested more than routine observation. An experienced crew member, he thought, someone who knew this job inside and out. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and Malik felt that familiar sensation of movement, of being untethered from the earth. Beside him, Nia's grip on the armrest tightened. "It's okay," Malik said, covering her hand with his. "This is the fun part." They taxied for what felt like forever, following a line of aircraft toward the runway. Through the window, Malik could see other planes taking off and landing, the constant ballet of commercial aviation. Jets thundered overhead on approach. Ground vehicles zipped between taxiways. The whole airport was a living organism, breathing aircraft in and out with mechanical precision. "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff," came the announcement. The engine spooled up, that building roar that Malik remembered in his bones. The aircraft lurched forward, accelerating down the runway, faster and faster, until the nose lifted and suddenly they were airborne, climbing steeply into the morning sky. Nia gasped with delight as New York City spread out below them, the buildings shrinking, the rivers turning to silver ribbons, the whole world becoming small and perfect. "We're flying," she said, laughing. "We sure are, baby girl." The seatbelt sign dinged off once they reached cruising altitude. Around them, passengers immediately began the mid-flight shuffle, using the bathroom, retrieving items from overhead bins, settling in for the long haul. The businessman next to Malik pulled down his tray table and spread out his work, muttering to himself about quarterly projections. "Daddy, can I have some goldfish?" Nia asked. Malik retrieved the Ziploc bag from his backpack and handed it to her. She munched contentedly, alternating between eating and staring out the window at the clouds below. They looked like cotton from up here, Malik thought, like you could jump down and bounce on them like a trampoline. The flight attendants came through with the beverage service. Coffee for Malik, black, strong, necessary, apple juice for Nia. The kind flight attendant he'd noticed earlier paused at their row. "First time flying?" she asked Nia with a warm smile. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you're doing great. Where are you headed?" "Iceland," Nia said proudly, "to see volcanoes and waterfalls and maybe the northern lights." "That sounds like an adventure. You have a good trip, okay?" "Thank you." As the attendant moved on, Malik noticed her exchange a look with another crew member. Quick, almost imperceptible, but there. Something was off. He'd spent enough time around flight crews to recognize when they were concerned about something. But what? The flight was smooth, the weather was clear, everything seemed routine. He told himself he was being paranoid. Old instincts kicking in. He wasn't part of this world anymore. He was just a passenger now, just a tired father trying to give his daughter a good memory. The hours crawled past. Nia dozed off against the window, her notebook slipping from her lap. Malik tried to read his book but couldn't concentrate. His mind kept wandering back to the question she'd asked. "Were you ever a pilot?" He'd been more than just a pilot. For 10 years he'd been exceptional. Starting in the Air Force, flying cargo planes to every corner of the globe, then transitioning to commercial aviation, working his way up from regional carriers to the majors. He'd flown 737s, 757s, eventually graduated to wide bodies. His instructors had said he had natural instincts, that he could feel what an aircraft needed before the instruments told him. He'd been on track for captain before 35. Then came Flight 1, 847. Malik closed his eyes, but that only made the memories sharper. The storm they'd flown into over the Midwest, the wind shear. The way the aircraft had dropped 500 feet in seconds, passengers screaming, alarms blaring. He'd saved that flight, brought them down safely in conditions that should have killed everyone on board. But in the investigation that followed, questions were raised. Had he deviated from procedure? Should he have requested a different approach? The airline backed him publicly but grounded him privately, citing concerns about judgment under pressure. 3 weeks later, his wife left. Said she couldn't handle the stress, couldn't handle being married to someone whose career was in freefall. Malik had been so deep in his own spiral of shame and anger that he'd barely fought to keep her. And then she was gone, and he was alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a future that had collapsed like a house of cards. He'd tried to get another flying job, sent out dozens of applications. But word spread in the tight-knit aviation community. The pilot who'd been investigated, the one who couldn't be trusted. Doors closed. Opportunities vanished. Eventually he stopped trying, took the warehouse job because it paid enough to keep a roof over Naya's head and food on the table. Convinced himself that he was fine, that this was enough. But on nights when he couldn't sleep, when the walls of their small apartment felt like they were closing in, Malik would stand at the window and watch aircraft pass overhead, their navigation lights blinking red and green against the darkness, and he would feel that ache, that hollow space where his purpose used to be. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Reykjavik," the captain's voice announced over the PA system. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Malik gently shook Nia awake. She blinked up at him, confused for a moment, then remembered where they was. "Are we there?" she asked. "Almost, baby girl. Look out the window." Below them, the North Atlantic stretched to the horizon, dark and vast. In the distance, Malik could see the coast of Iceland emerging through scattered clouds, volcanic rock, patches of green, the geometric sprawl of Reykjavik coming into view. The aircraft banked gently, lining up for approach. Malik felt his pulse quicken slightly. This was always the most critical phase of flight, when aircraft were closest to the ground, when margins for error were smallest. But everything seemed routine. The descent was smooth, the engines hummed at a steady idle. The pilots up front clearly knew what they were doing. Then, without warning, the aircraft jolted hard to the left. Passengers gasped. A woman across the aisle screamed. Nia grabbed Malik's arm. "Daddy!" "It's okay," Malik said, though his own heart was hammering. "Just turbulence." But it wasn't turbulence. Malik had flown through enough storms to know the difference. That jolt had been mechanical, something in the flight control system. He looked out the window and saw the wing flex more than it should, the control surfaces moving erratically. The aircraft leveled out, but the ride was rougher now. They were still descending, but the nose was pitched at an odd angle. Malik's mind raced through the possibilities. Hydraulic failure? Electrical problem? The pilots would be running checklists right now, trying to diagnose and fix whatever had gone wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was steady but strained. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we're going to continue our approach to Reykjavik and have emergency crews standing by as a precaution. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright and locked position." Minor technical difficulties. That was airline speak for something is very wrong, but we don't want you to panic. Around Malik, passengers were murmuring nervously. Some were texting furiously on their phones. Others had their eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The businessman next to him had finally put away his laptop, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "Daddy, what's happening?" Nia asked, her voice small and scared. "The plane is having a little trouble," Malik said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But the pilots are very good at their job. They're going to land us safely." "You promise?" Malik looked into his daughter's eyes and saw his whole world reflected there. 7 years old, and already she'd been through so much. Lost her mother, grown up with too little and learned to ask for less. Deserved better than any of this. "I promise," he said, and prayed it wasn't a lie. The aircraft descended through 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. Malik could see the runway now, a strip of asphalt cutting through the Icelandic landscape. They were lined up on glide path, but the aircraft was wallowing, fighting the pilot's inputs. The controls clearly weren't responding the way they should. 2,000 feet. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk. Malik felt the drag increase, the aircraft slowing, but they were coming in hot, faster than normal. The pilots were compensating for reduced control authority, keeping their speed up so they'd have enough elevator effectiveness to flare for landing. 1,000 feet. "Flight attendants, be seated," came the command. The attendants scrambled to their jump seats and strapped in. The cabin was absolutely silent except for the roar of engines and the whistle of wind over the fuselage. 500 feet. Malik could see people on the ground now. Emergency vehicles lining the runway. Foam trucks. Ambulances. The whole emergency response apparatus of a modern airport on high alert, 200 feet. "Brace, brace, brace!" someone shouted. Passengers bent forward, heads between knees, hands over their heads. Nia was too small to properly brace, so Malik pulled her close, tucking her head against his chest and wrapping his arms around her. The aircraft hit the runway hard, harder than any landing Malik had ever experienced. The impact rattled his teeth, sent luggage tumbling from overhead bins, cracked at least one window somewhere in the cabin. Nia screamed. People all around them screamed, but they were down. The wheels were on the ground. They'd made it. Then the aircraft swerved violently to the right. The pilots were fighting it. Malik could feel their inputs through the airframe, could imagine them standing on the rudder pedals trying to keep the aircraft on the center line. But something was catastrophically wrong with the steering. The nose gear wasn't responding. They were sliding sideways down the runway at over 100 miles per hour, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Hold on!" Malik shouted, though his voice was lost in the cacophony. The right main gear left the pavement. They were half on the runway, half on the grass. Malik felt the deceleration as the landing gear dug into soft earth. The aircraft was still moving, still sliding, heading toward a drainage ditch at the edge of the airfield. Time seemed to slow. Malik could see individual blades of grass whipping past the window, could count the rivets in the wing, could feel each beat of his heart like a drum. The aircraft came to a stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The engine spooled down to idle, and in the sudden relative quiet, Malik could hear crying, praying, someone being sick in the back of the cabin. "Is everyone okay?" a flight attendant called out. Malik looked down at Naya. She was sobbing against his chest, terrified but unharmed. Around them, passengers were starting to move, checking themselves for injuries, looking around in shock. "We're okay, baby girl," Malik whispered. "We're okay." But before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the cabin door opened and emergency personnel flooded in. Paramedics, firefighters, airport officials, all speaking in rapid Icelandic and broken English. "Everyone off the aircraft. Move quickly, but do not run. Leave all belongings behind." The evacuation was controlled chaos. Passengers stumbled down the aisles, helping each other, some still crying, others in a state of shock. Malik kept Nia close, guiding her toward the exit. As they passed the cockpit, he glanced inside and saw the flight crew still at their stations, running post-emergency checklists with shaking hands. The senior flight attendant, the one who'd been kind to Nia earlier, was stationed at the door, helping people down the stairs that had been rolled up to the aircraft. "Watch your step," she said to each passenger. "You're doing great. Watch your step." When Malik reached her, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief, certainly, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. Like she'd seen something in him during those terrifying final minutes. "Thank you," Malik said. "Thank you," she replied, and he had the strange feeling they were thanking each other for different things. They descended the stairs and walked across the tarmac to a waiting bus. Other passengers were already aboard, wrapped in blankets despite it being summer, drinking water handed out by airport staff. Nia pressed against Malik's side, unusually quiet. As the bus pulled away from the aircraft, Malik looked back at the Boeing 767 sitting askew on the grass, emergency vehicles surrounding it like attendants around a fallen giant. They'd survived. Against significant odds, they'd survived. But something about the way the aircraft had handled during that approach bothered him. Those weren't the control inputs of an aircraft with a minor hydraulic problem. That was something more fundamental, something that should have been caught during pre-flight or maintenance. The bus delivered them to a terminal building where airport officials and airline representatives were scrambling to process nearly 200 unexpected guests. Coffee appeared from somewhere. Sandwiches. Translators. Someone set up a children's area with toys and coloring books, and Nia joined the other kids there, all of them too young to fully understand how close they'd come to disaster. Malik found a chair against the wall and sat down heavily. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had kept him functional during the landing was wearing off, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. "You did well." Malik looked up to find the senior flight attendant standing over him. Up close, he could see she was probably in her mid-50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in aviation. "I didn't do anything," Malik said. "You kept your daughter calm. That's more than most parents manage in an emergency." She paused. You're a pilot. It wasn't a question. Was, Malik said. Long time ago. Not that long. I saw how you were watching the instruments during descent. Saw how you braced when you knew we were coming in hot. She held out her hand. Margaret Sullivan, 30 years with this airline. Malik shook her hand. Malik Carter, 5 years out of the cockpit. Why'd you leave? He could have given her the short answer, the easy lie. But something about almost dying together made pretense feel pointless. I made some people nervous, he said. Saved a flight during a bad storm, but the investigation didn't like my methods. Pilot deviation, they called it. I called it keeping 173 people alive. We agreed to disagree. Margaret nodded slowly. I remember that case. Flight 1847. You're that Carter. Yeah, I'm that Carter. For what it's worth, I flew with the captain on that flight. He told me you saved his ass that night. Said you were the best first officer he'd ever worked with. Malik felt something catch in his throat. He said that? He did. Also said the investigation was political bullshit from people who'd never flown in weather worse than light rain. She glanced toward the window where the crippled aircraft was still visible. We're going to need pilots to ferry that bird out of here once it's inspected, if you're interested. I don't have a current type rating. Details. I know people who owe me favors. She pulled out a business card and handed it to him. Think about it. Before Malik could respond, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the terminal entrance. Paramedics were rushing in with a stretcher, and Malik caught a glimpse of the patient they were wheeling through. A man in a captain's uniform, oxygen mask over his face, clearly in distress. That's Captain Holland, Margaret said quietly. Been complaining of chest pain since we landed. Malik watched as they loaded the captain into an ambulance and sped away, lights flashing. The first officer, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, stood in the terminal looking lost and overwhelmed, fielding questions from what appeared to be airline management and Icelandic aviation authorities. He did well to get us down, Margaret said, but he's never going to forget this day. The hours that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews with investigators, medical checks, and logistical nightmares. The airline was scrambling to find accommodation for 200 stranded passengers and trying to figure out how to get everyone to their final destinations. Some people were rebooked on flights through European hubs. Others would have to wait days for available seats. Malik and Nia ended up in a modest hotel near the airport, courtesy of the airline. The room was clean and warm, with 2 beds and a window overlooking a parking lot. After everything they'd been through, it felt like luxury. Nia had finally crashed around 8 p.m., falling asleep mid-sentence while trying to tell Malik about the toys in the children's area. He tucked her in, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and just watched her breathe for a long moment. His daughter. His whole world. Still here. Still safe. He stepped out onto the small balcony and pulled out his phone. 17 missed calls. Dozens of texts. News of the emergency landing had spread, and apparently their names had been on the passenger manifest that had made its way to media outlets. He scrolled through the messages. His sister, frantic with worry. His supervisor at the warehouse, oddly supportive for once. A few old friends from his flying days, people he hadn't heard from in years, all reaching out. And one message from a number he didn't recognize. Heard you were on that flight. Glad you're okay. We should talk. James Fletcher. Malik stared at that name for a long time. Captain James Fletcher, his old training instructor from the Air Force. The man who'd taught him everything he knew about flying, who'd believed in him when others had doubts, who'd written the recommendation that got him his first commercial job. He hadn't spoken to Fletcher in 3 years. Not since Fletcher had testified on his behalf during the investigation and been quietly reprimanded for it by airline executives who didn't want senior captains contradicting their narrative. Malik typed out a reply. Thanks. Yeah, we should. He sent it before he could overthink it, then put the phone away and stood looking out at the Icelandic summer night. The sun barely set this time of year, just dipped toward the horizon and hung there, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the whine of jet engines. Another aircraft taking off, climbing into that perpetual twilight. Malik watched it rise and bank to the west, its navigation lights blinking steady against the pale sky. He'd promised himself he was done with flying. Done with the stress, the politics, the crushing responsibility of holding hundreds of lives in his hands. He'd convinced himself that being a warehouse worker was enough, that providing for Nia was all that mattered. But standing on that balcony, listening to the sound of aircraft overhead, feeling the business card from Margaret Sullivan in his pocket like a small weight, Malik had to admit the truth. He missed it. God help him. He missed it so much it hurt. The next morning brought news, some good and some troubling. Captain Holland had suffered a moderate heart attack and would be recovering in a Reykjavik hospital for at least a week. The aircraft had been inspected overnight, and while details were scarce, preliminary reports suggested multiple hydraulic system failures, a cascade effect that should have been caught during routine maintenance. Nia was surprisingly chipper at breakfast, chattering about whether they'd still get to see the waterfalls and volcanoes. The hotel had arranged for some of the stranded passengers to take a bus tour of the immediate area, a small gesture of goodwill while everyone waited for their onward flights. "Can we go, Daddy? Please?" Malik looked at his daughter's hopeful face and couldn't say no. They'd survived a near disaster. They deserved to see something beautiful. The tour was exactly what they needed. The guide took them to Thingvellir National Park, where Nia stood in the rift valley between tectonic plates and declared herself half in America and half in Europe. They saw Gullfoss waterfall, the massive cascade of water thundering into a gorge with such force that mist rose like smoke. They visited Geysir, watched Strokur erupt every few minutes, Nia squealing with delight each time the boiling water shot into the air. For a few hours, Malik let himself forget about the emergency landing, the investigators, the weight of his past. He was just a father on vacation with his daughter, and that was enough. But on the bus ride back to the hotel, his phone rang. Unknown number, Icelandic area code. "Mr. Carter, this is Bjorn Magnusson from the Icelandic Transportation Safety Board. We'd like to speak with you about yesterday's incident. Would you be available this evening?" Malik glanced at Naya, who was dozing against his shoulder. "What do you need from me? I was just a passenger." "Actually, Mr. Carter, we've been reviewing the cockpit voice recorder and speaking with the crew. It seems you may have been more than just a passenger. The first officer mentioned you came to the cockpit during the emergency." Malik's stomach dropped. That's not accurate. I never... Mr. Carter, we're not looking to assign blame. We're trying to understand what happened. The more information we have, the better. Please, this is just a conversation." Against his better judgment, Malik agreed to meet them at 8 p.m. The interview took place in a conference room at the airport administrative building. Two investigators sat across from Malik, Bjorn Magnusson, a serious man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses, and his colleague Anna Sigurdsson, younger and more sympathetic. "Thank you for coming," Magnusson said. "As I mentioned on the phone, we're investigating yesterday's incident. The aircraft experienced multiple hydraulic failures during approach, which severely compromised the flight controls." "I figured it was something like that," Malik said carefully. "Mr. Carter, we need to clarify something. The first officer, during his preliminary interview, was quite distraught. He mentioned that during the emergency, you assisted in the cockpit. Can you explain what happened?" Malik felt the room close in around him. This was it, the moment where everything could go sideways again. "I didn't assist," he said. I talked to the first officer briefly. He was overwhelmed. The captain was incapacitated. I have some aviation background, so I offered some suggestions. That's all." "Some suggestions," Anna repeated, her tone gentle. "Mr. Carter, we've reviewed your aviation history. 10 years as a military and commercial pilot. Extensive experience on wide-body aircraft. Is it fair to say your suggestions were based on significant expertise?" "I haven't flown in 5 years." "But you remember how?" Malik met her eyes. "You don't forget." Magnusson pulled out a tablet and turned it to show Malik a document. "This is the first officer's statement. He says, and I quote, 'I thought we were going to die. The hydraulics were failing, the aircraft wasn't responding, and I didn't know what to do. Then this passenger came to the cockpit, Mr. Carter, and he knew. He told me to try split controls, to use differential thrust for directional control. He walked me through the approach like he'd done it 1,000 times. Without him, I don't think we would have made it." The room was silent for a long moment. "I just talked him through some basics," Malik said quietly. Any pilot would have done the same. But you weren't there as a pilot, Anna said. You were there as a passenger. Technically, you violated several regulations by entering the cockpit during flight. Here it comes, Malik thought. Another investigation. Another black mark. Another door closing. But Magnuson surprised him. Mr. Carter, you should know that both the first officer and the senior flight attendant have given statements crediting you with keeping the crew calm during a catastrophic emergency. The preliminary analysis suggests that without the control inputs you advised, that aircraft would likely have crashed short of the runway. I didn't touch the controls, Malik said quickly. We know. But you did something perhaps more important. You provided expertise and calm leadership during a crisis. Magnuson closed his tablet. Officially, I have to note that unauthorized persons are not permitted in the cockpit during flight operations. Unofficially, you saved lives yesterday, Mr. Carter. I want you to know that we recognize that. Malik didn't trust himself to speak. Anna leaned forward. Can I ask why you stopped flying? Malik told them the story. All of it. Flight 1847, the storm, the investigation, the way his career had crumbled despite doing everything right. They listened without interruption, and when he finished, Magnuson and Anna exchanged a look. Aviation politics, Magnuson said with clear disgust. We have the same problems here. Good pilots sidelined because they make administrators uncomfortable. He stood and extended his hand. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. And thank you for what you did yesterday. Walking back to the hotel, Malik felt something shift inside him. For 5 years, he'd carried the weight of that investigation like a stone around his neck. He'd internalized the message that he was somehow deficient, that his judgment couldn't be trusted. But yesterday, when everything went to hell at 30,000 feet, his instincts had been right. His training had held. He'd kept his head and helped bring home an aircraft that had every reason to fall from the sky. Maybe he wasn't broken after all. Back at the hotel, Nia was still awake despite the late hour, watching Icelandic television she couldn't understand and eating ice cream provided by the sympathetic hotel staff. Daddy, she called when he came in, did you know they have ice cream here that tastes like licorice? It's weird, but I like it. Malik sat down next to her on the bed. Nia, I need to tell you something. She looked at him with sudden concern, the way kids do when they sense serious conversation coming. Yesterday, on the plane when everything got scary, I went up to the front to help the pilots. Just for a little bit. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry, but I need you to know that Daddy knows how to fly planes. I used to be a pilot before you were born. Nia processed this with the gravity of a 7-year-old receiving important news. Were you a good pilot? Yeah, baby girl. I was pretty good. Then why did you stop? How do you explain adult failures to a child? How do you make them understand that sometimes the world doesn't work the way it should? That doing the right thing can still cost you everything? Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Malik said carefully, or sometimes other people think they made mistakes even when they didn't. And I stopped flying because it got too complicated. I thought it would be better to do something else. But you helped yesterday? I did. So you're still a good pilot? Malik pulled his daughter close. You know what? I think maybe I am. She hugged him tight, and they stayed like that for a while, father and daughter, survivors, travelers far from home. The next day, the airline managed to book them on a flight to Reykjavik's domestic airport, and then on to a smaller coastal town where they could salvage what remained of their vacation. It wasn't the trip they'd planned, but it was something. As they waited at the gate, Malik's phone rang again, James Fletcher's name on the screen. Captain Fletcher, Malik answered. Carter, heard you had quite an adventure. Fletcher's voice was exactly as Malik remembered, gravelly, direct, with an undercurrent of dry humor. Seems like you can't stay out of trouble. Wasn't looking for it, sir. Never are. Listen, I'm retiring next month, 28 years with Atlas Air. They're trying to hire new captains faster than they can train them. I told them I knew a guy. Best natural pilot I ever trained. Guy who got screwed by politics but never lost his touch. Malik's heart was pounding. Captain, I don't have a current medical. Don't have type ratings. Haven't logged time in 5 years. Details. All of it. Just details. You want back in or not? Malik looked across the waiting area at Naya, who was showing another little girl her notebook full of Iceland drawings. His daughter, who deserved a father who was whole, who had purpose, who could provide more than just the bare minimum. "Yeah," Malik said. "Yeah, I want back in." "Good. Send me your contact info. I'll start making calls." "Oh, and Carter? Welcome home." "Welcome." The call with Fletcher lasted another 10 minutes. Details about check rides and simulator sessions and medical certificates, but Malik could barely concentrate on any of it. His mind was spinning, caught between the terror of hoping again and the practical reality of what coming back to aviation would actually mean. When he finally hung up, his hands were shaking. "Daddy, our plane is here," Nia called, pointing out the window at a small turboprop aircraft taxiing up to the gate. Malik pocketed his phone and joined her at the window. The aircraft was a Dash 8, probably 40 seats, the kind of regional workhorse that connected small communities across Iceland. Nothing like the wide body they'd nearly died in 2 days ago, but seeing it made Malik's chest tight anyway. "You ready for another flight, baby girl?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Nia looked up at him with complete trust. "You'll keep us safe." The weight of that statement, the absolute faith the child had in her father, nearly broke him. "I'll do my best." This flight was mercifully uneventful. Smooth air, professional crew, a 40-minute hop along the coast that gave them stunning views of black sand beaches and distant glaciers. Nia pressed her face to the window the whole way, narrating everything she saw in a stream of consciousness monologue that made the businessman across the aisle smile despite himself. They landed in a coastal town whose name Malik couldn't pronounce, collected their single backpack from the tiny baggage claim, and took a taxi to a guest house that Margaret Sullivan had helped arrange. The owner was a woman in her 70s who spoke perfect English with a British accent and immediately took Nia under her wing, showing her the resident cat and promising to teach her how to make traditional Icelandic pancakes. That evening, after Nia had fallen asleep in their small but cozy room, Malik sat at the wooden desk and opened his laptop. He had emails to answer, calls to return, a life back home that was waiting for him. But first, he pulled up the website for the Federal Aviation Administration and started the process of renewing his medical certificate. The application asked questions he hadn't thought about in years. Last flight as pilot in command? 5 years, 3 months, 12 days ago? He knew the exact date. Total flight hours? 4,200 and change. Any medical conditions that might affect his ability to fly? He hesitated on that one. Did depression count? Did the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from working warehouse shifts and raising a daughter alone qualify as a medical condition? He checked the box for no and kept moving. His phone buzzed with the text from his sister. "Saw you on the news. Are you guys okay? Mom is freaking out. Call when you can." Malik sighed and dialed. His mother answered on the first ring. "Malik, Joseph Carter, I have been worried sick. They said the plane nearly crashed. They said people were injured." "We're fine, Mom. I promise. Not a scratch on either of us." "Don't you 'we're fine' me. I saw the pictures of that airplane sitting in the grass. You could have been killed, but we weren't. We're in Iceland. We're safe, and Nia's having a great time." There was a pause, and when his mother spoke again, her voice was quieter. "They're saying on the news that a passenger helped land the plane. They're calling him a hero. Malik, that wasn't you, was it?" Malik closed his eyes. "I just gave some advice, Mom. That's all." "You went to the cockpit." "The captain was having a heart attack. The first officer needed help." "Oh, baby," his mother's voice cracked. "You went back." "It was one time. An emergency. But you went back. After everything they did to you, after they destroyed your career, you still went back to help." Malik didn't know what to say to that. His mother had been the one who'd held him together after the investigation, who'd shown up at his apartment with groceries when he was too depressed to leave the house, who'd taken care of Nia when he couldn't take care of himself. She knew what aviation had cost him. And she knew what it meant that he'd stepped back into that world, even for just a few minutes. "Captain Fletcher called me," Malik said. "He wants to help me get current again, get back to flying." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Malik thought the call had dropped. "Mom? Is that what you want?" she asked carefully. "I don't know. Maybe. Yes, I think so. Then you should do it. Life's too short to walk away from the things that make you whole, baby." I learned that the hard way. They talked for a few more minutes, Malik assuring her again that they were safe, promising to send pictures, agreeing to call when they got back to the States. When he hung up, he felt lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't know was there, and someone had finally helped him set it down. The next 3 days were a gift. They hiked to waterfalls and explored lava fields. They visited a small aviation museum where Nia spent an hour in the cockpit of a vintage DC-3, pretending to fly while Malik pointed out the instruments and explained what each one did. They ate fresh fish at harbors where fishing boats bobbed in the swell and seabirds wheeled overhead, calling in voices that sounded like questions. On their last full day, they drove out to see the northern lights. It was technically the wrong season, but the guest house owner knew a spot where atmospheric conditions sometimes cooperated even in summer. They sat in a field wrapped in blankets at 11 p.m. while the sky glowed with perpetual twilight, and just when Malik thought they'd driven 2 hours for nothing, a faint green shimmer appeared on the northern horizon. "Daddy, look!" Nia whispered, like speaking too loud might scare it away. The aurora intensified, curtains of green and purple light dancing across the sky in patterns that defied description. Malik had seen a lot of beautiful things from 30,000 feet. Sunrises over the Pacific, storm cells lit by lightning, the curve of the earth itself. But this was different. This was magic, witnessed from the ground, shared with his daughter, a moment of pure wonder that had nothing to do with aviation or careers or any of the complicated machinery of adult life. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Nia said. "Yeah, baby girl, me too." They flew home 2 days later on a commercial flight that was so routine it almost felt anticlimactic. No emergencies, no drama, just 6 hours of watching movies and eating mediocre airline food. When they landed at JFK, Malik's supervisor had arranged for someone to pick them up, a kindness that surprised Malik, until he realized the warehouse had gotten a lot of positive press from his involvement in the Iceland incident. "Local hero returns home," read the headline on the newspaper someone had left on the break room table when Malik showed up for his first shift back. The article was short and got several details wrong, but there was a photo of him and Nia deplaning in New York, and the caption identified him as the former pilot who helped save Flight 7243 when disaster struck over the Atlantic. His coworkers treated him differently now. Not quite with respect. Warehouse work had a way of leveling everyone, but with curiosity. During lunch break, 3 different people asked him what it had been like up there, whether he'd been scared, whether he thought about getting back into flying. "Thinking about it," Malik said to the last question, and saying it out loud made it more real somehow. That night, after Nia was asleep in their small apartment, Malik's phone rang. Unknown number, but by now he'd learned to answer those. "Mr. Carter, this is David Jang from Atlas Air. Captain Fletcher gave me your name. I understand you might be interested in returning to commercial aviation." Malik's heart kicked into high gear. "That's right, sir. I've reviewed your file. Impressive record. 10 years? No incidents except that Flight 1847 situation, which frankly was a witch hunt from what I can tell. You saved that airplane." "Thank you, sir. Here's where we are. We're desperately short on qualified pilots. We can fast-track your medical, get you into simulator training, have you flying within 6 months if you're willing to put in the work. But I need to be straight with you. The airline industry has changed since you left. Long hours, lots of time away from home, and the pay isn't what it used to be, at least not at first. You've got a daughter. That's going to be a factor." Malik thought about Nia, asleep in the next room. Thought about the promise he'd made to always be there for her, to never let her down the way her mother had. But he also thought about the look on her face in that DC-3 cockpit, the way her eyes had lit up when he'd explained how aircraft flew, the pride in her voice when she told the other kids at the guest house that her daddy was a pilot. "My daughter comes first," Malik said. "Always. But I think I can do both. I think I need to do both." "Good answer. Check your email tomorrow. I'm sending you a preliminary offer and a training schedule. Look it over, talk to your family, and let me know by end of week." The call ended, and Malik sat in the dark living room of their tiny apartment, listening to the sound of traffic outside and the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythm of his daughter's breathing from the bedroom. This was a crossroads moment. He could feel it, a chance to reclaim something he'd lost, or to stay safe in the small life he'd built. His phone buzzed again. A text from Margaret Sullivan. "Heard Atlas reached out. Take the job. You belong in the sky." Then another text, this one from the first officer who'd been flying Flight 7243. Mr. Carter, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I've been flying for 7 years, and that was the scariest day of my career. You kept me calm when I was falling apart. You reminded me why I wanted to be a pilot in the first place. I hope you find your way back to the cockpit. The industry needs people like you. Malik read that message 3 times. People like you. He'd spent 5 years convinced that he was the problem, that he was the pilot who couldn't be trusted. But maybe that had never been true. Maybe he'd just been someone who made powerful people uncomfortable by refusing to compromise on safety. Maybe being the problem was actually being the solution. The email from Atlas Air arrived at 6 a.m. the next morning. Malik read it over coffee while Naya ate cereal and watched cartoons. The offer was straightforward. 6 months of intensive training, starting with medical certification and recurrent training on wide-body aircraft, followed by simulator sessions and eventually supervised flights. The pay during training was modest, barely more than he made at the warehouse. But after certification, it jumped significantly. And there were benefits: health insurance, retirement matching, travel privileges for family members. "Daddy, why are you smiling at your computer?" Naya asked through a mouthful of cereal. "Because I might have a new job, baby girl." "Doing what?" "Flying airplanes." She abandoned her cereal and climbed into his lap, peering at the screen. "You're going to be a pilot again?" "Maybe. Would that be okay with you?" Nia thought about this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "Would you have to go away a lot?" "Sometimes, but I'd always come back." "Like when you went to the cockpit on our plane? You came back." "Exactly like that. No matter what, I always come back to you." "Then it's okay. You should do it. You were happy when you were talking about flying in Iceland." Malik held his daughter close, marveling at her wisdom. 7 years old, and she could already see things he tried to hide. "You're pretty smart, you know that?" "I know," she said with absolute confidence, then squirmed out of his lap and went back to her cartoons. Malik hit reply on the email and typed 5 words. "I accept. Let's get started." The next 6 months were a blur of activity. Malik kept his warehouse job during the transition, working nights so he could attend ground school during the day. He studied aerodynamics he'd once known by heart, relearned regulations that had changed during his time away, memorized procedures for aircraft systems he'd flown 1,000 hours on but needed to prove he still understood. His medical certification hit a snag when the aviation medical examiner asked about his mental health history. Malik had to be honest about the depression after losing his career, the months of barely functioning, the way he'd struggled. But the AME was sympathetic and practical. "Mr. Carter, half the pilots I examine have been through something difficult. The question isn't whether you struggled, it's whether you got help and whether you're stable now." "Are you?" "Yes, sir." "I am." "Then we'll get you certified. But I'm requiring a psychological evaluation and a letter from a therapist. Standard procedure for anyone with a history of depression." Malik swallowed his pride and found a therapist who specialized in working with aviation professionals. Dr. Sarah Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd done psychological evaluations for pilots for 15 years. "Tell me why you want to fly again," she said in their first session. Malik had prepared an answer about professional fulfillment and financial stability, but when he opened his mouth, the truth came out instead. "Because when I'm on the ground, I'm only half alive, and my daughter deserves a father who's whole." They met twice a week for 6 weeks. Malik talked about things he'd never said out loud: the shame of the investigation, the guilt of not fighting harder for his career, the fear that he'd fail again if he tried. Dr. Chen listened without judgment and asked questions that forced him to examine assumptions he'd been carrying like stone. "You know what I notice?" she said in their final session. "You keep talking about failure like it's a character trait. But failing at something doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. The real question is whether you learned from it." "I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you." "True. And?" "And that sometimes you have to do it anyway." Dr. Chen smiled. "I think you're ready to fly again, Mr. Carter." The simulator training was brutal. Malik spent hours strapped into a mock cockpit that moved and shook and replicated every possible emergency. Engine failures on takeoff, hydraulic malfunctions, electrical fires, decompression events. The instructors threw everything at him: testing not just his technical skills but his judgment under pressure. Captain Fletcher showed up for one of the sessions, observing from the control room as Malik worked through a particularly nasty scenario involving multiple system failures over mountainous terrain. "He's rusty," the lead instructor commented, "but his instincts are solid. Give him another month, and he'll be better than most of the captains we're certifying." Fletcher nodded. "He always had the touch. Just needed to remember he still has it." Between training sessions, Malik's life became a careful choreography. He'd work the warehouse from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., grab 3 hours of sleep, get Nia ready for school, attend ground school or simulator sessions, pick Nia up from his mother's house, help with homework, make dinner, and collapse into bed to do it all again. It was unsustainable. He knew that, but it was also finite. 6 months. He could do anything for 6 months. Nia adapted to the chaos better than Malik expected. His mother picked her up from school most days, and they developed their own routine: homework at the kitchen table, snacks that were probably too indulgent, Disney movies before bed. Nia never complained about the changes, never asked why Daddy was gone so much. She seemed to understand in that intuitive way kids have that this was important. "How's Daddy's flying school?" she'd ask his mother every day. "He's working hard, sweetheart." "Good. He needs to practice so he can be the best pilot." 4 months into training, Malik got his first chance to fly an actual aircraft. Not as pilot in command, but as a supervised first officer on a cargo flight from Memphis to Miami. The captain was a grizzled veteran named Rodriguez, who'd been flying for Atlas for 20 years. "Heard you're the guy from Iceland," Rodriguez said as they ran through pre-flight checks. "News travels fast. In this industry? Always. You did good work up there. First officer on that flight is a friend of mine. He said you saved his ass." "He did the actual flying. I just talked him through it." Rodriguez gave him a skeptical look. "Don't sell yourself short, Carter. Talking someone through a hydraulic failure when you're not even supposed to be in the cockpit? That takes balls and brains. Now let's see if you can still fly." The flight was perfect. Clear skies, light winds, textbook procedures from pushback to shutdown. Malik handled the takeoff, and the moment the wheels left the runway, something settled into place inside him. This was right. This was where he belonged. "You've still got it," Rodriguez said as they leveled off at cruise altitude. "Smooth as silk. Why'd you ever leave?" Malik told him the story. Rodriguez listened, and when Malik finished, the older pilot shook his head. "I remember that case. Bunch of paper pushers who've never flown in actual weather making decisions about what constitutes proper procedure. You got screwed, Carter, but you're back now. That's what matters." Over the Atlantic, somewhere between Florida and the darkness of open water, Rodriguez said, "You know what the difference is between a good pilot and a great one?" "What's that?" "A good pilot follows the rules. A great pilot knows when to break them to save lives. You're the second kind. Don't let anyone tell you different." Malik passed his final check ride on a cold December morning, 5 months and 3 weeks after signing the contract with Atlas Air. The examiner was a retired Air Force colonel who put him through every scenario in the book, and a few that weren't. When it was over, the colonel shut down the simulator and turned to face Malik. "Congratulations, Captain Carter. You're certified." "Captain." The word hit Malik like a physical blow. He'd been a first officer before, working his way up the seniority list. But captain was different. Captain meant command. Captain meant responsibility. Captain meant they trusted him completely. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You earned it. Now go tell your daughter." Malik drove straight from the training facility to his mother's house, still in his uniform, his new captain's wings gleaming on his chest. Nia was in the backyard playing with the neighbor's dog when he arrived. "Daddy!" she screamed, running to him. He scooped her up and spun her around. "Guess what, baby girl?" "What?" "I'm a captain now. A real captain." Nia touched the wings on his uniform with reverence. "You did it. You're a pilot again." "I am." "I knew you would be. You're the best pilot in the whole world." Malik's mother stood in the doorway, crying and smiling at the same time. "I'm so proud of you, baby." That night, Malik took Nia out for ice cream, the fancy place they could never afford before, and told her what his new schedule would look like. He'd be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time, flying cargo routes across the country and sometimes internationally. But when he was home, he'd really be home. No more warehouse shifts, No more exhaustion that made him too tired to play. Just them. Where will you fly? Nia asked. All over. Europe, Asia, South America. Anywhere they need cargo delivered. Will you bring me back presents? Malik laughed. Maybe a few. His first official flight as captain was a week later. A straightforward run from New York to Frankfurt, carrying automotive parts and electronics. His first officer was a woman named Lisa Park, who'd been with Atlas for 3 years. First flight back? She asked during pre-flight. That obvious? You're checking everything 3 times. It's either your first flight or you're incredibly paranoid. Maybe both. Park smiled. I looked up your history. Flight 1847. That was textbook emergency handling. You got a raw deal. Ancient history now. Maybe, but for what it's worth, I'm glad to be flying with you. Rather have a captain who knows how to handle a real emergency than one who's only ever flown in perfect conditions. They pushed back from the gate at 10 p.m., the aircraft heavy with cargo and fuel. Malik ran through the checklist with practiced precision, feeling the weight of command settle onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. This was real. This was happening. Atlas 447, you're cleared for takeoff. Runway 4 left, the tower controller said. Cleared for takeoff, 4 left. Atlas 447, Malik replied, his voice steady. He advanced the throttles, felt the massive engines spool up, watched the airspeed indicator come alive. The runway lights blurred past. 80 knots, 100, 1, the point of no return. Rotate. The nose lifted, the mains left the runway, and they were flying. New York fell away below them, a glittering sprawl of light stretching to the horizon. Malik banked gently to the northeast, climbing into the night sky, and felt something inside him finally heal. He was whole again, not because someone had given him permission or because an investigation had been overturned, but because he'd chosen to believe in himself when no one else would. Nice takeoff, Park said. Thanks, I've missed this. I can tell. They flew through the night in comfortable silence, monitoring systems, making small talk, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic like a promise. Malik thought about Nia asleep in her bed back home, thought about the life they were building together, thought about how far they'd come from that terrifying moment in Iceland when he'd thought they might die. His phone buzzed with the text message, somehow getting through despite being at altitude. The aircraft's Wi-Fi system must have connected. It was from Margaret Sullivan. Heard you made captain. Told you that you belonged in the sky. Proud of you. Then another message, this one from the Icelandic first officer. Congratulations, Captain Carter. The world is safer with you in the cockpit. Malik smiled and put his phone away. 6 months ago, he'd been a warehouse worker with no future beyond the next shift. Now he was a captain, commanding an aircraft across an ocean, with a daughter who believed in him and a second chance he'd almost been too afraid to take. The sun climbed higher, painting the clouds below in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere ahead, Europe was waking up. And somewhere behind him, in a small apartment in New York, his daughter was probably waking too, getting ready for school, maybe thinking about her father who flew through the sky. You know what I love about this job? Park said, breaking the silence. What's that? Every day, we get to see the sunrise from up here. Doesn't matter what's happening on the ground. Up here, it's always beautiful. Malik looked out at the endless sky, the curve of the earth, the play of light on clouds, and knew she was right. This was where he belonged. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got a second chance to live the truth of who you were always meant to be. Frankfurt welcomed them with typical German efficiency, perfect weather, clear communications, and ground crew that had their cargo offloaded before Malik had finished his post-flight paperwork. The layover was 18 hours, enough time to sleep, eat a real meal, and video call Nia before her bedtime back home. Daddy, Mrs. Patterson says I need to do a presentation about what my parents do for work, Nia said, her face filling the small screen of his phone. Can I tell everyone you're a pilot? Of course you can, baby girl. Can I bring pictures? I'll send you some. Maybe one of me in the cockpit. Will the other kids believe me? Tommy Morrison's dad is a dentist and he brought in fake teeth. That's pretty cool. Malik smiled. Well, I can't bring you an airplane, but I can bring you something from every place I fly to. Deal? Deal. Where are you now? Germany. It's morning here, but night there. That's weird. Is Germany nice? It is. Cold, though. Lots of snow. They talked for another 20 minutes about school and her friends and the stray cat that had started hanging around his mother's house. When they finally said goodbye, Malik felt the familiar ache of missing her, but it was different now. Before, when he'd worked the warehouse, he'd been physically present but emotionally absent, too exhausted to really be there. Now, even when he was thousands of miles away, he felt more connected to his daughter than he had in years. His phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line made his stomach drop. Regarding Flight 7243, legal inquiry. Malik opened it with trembling hands. The message was from a law firm in Boston representing a passenger from the Iceland flight. A passenger named Gerald Whitmore, who was claiming psychological trauma from the emergency landing and was pursuing litigation against the airline. The email informed Malik that his name had come up in the investigation and he might be called to give a deposition about his role in the incident. "You've got to be kidding me," Malik muttered. He forwarded the email to David Zhang at Atlas Air with a short message. "This just came through. Not sure what it means for my employment. Wanted to keep you informed." Zhang's response came back within an hour. "Don't worry about it. Standard procedure for these incidents. We'll provide legal support if needed. You did nothing wrong. Focus on flying." But the email had shaken something loose in Malik's mind. For 6 months, he'd been so focused on getting back in the cockpit that he'd almost forgotten about Iceland, about those terrifying minutes when he'd stepped into a role he had no legal right to fill. What if this lawsuit brought everything back? What if the investigation determined he'd violated regulations by entering the cockpit? What if he lost everything again, just when he'd finally gotten it back? He barely slept that night, his mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. By the time he and Park were back in the cockpit for the return flight to New York, Malik felt like he'd aged a decade. "You okay?" Park asked as they ran through pre-flight checks. "Just tired." "You look stressed. Something happened?" Malik hesitated, then decided honesty was better than pretense. "Got an email about a lawsuit from the Iceland thing. One of the passengers is claiming trauma." Park snorted. "Of course they are. Probably saw an opportunity for a payout. Don't let it get to you. You saved that flight. Anyone with half a brain can see that. Doesn't mean it won't derail my career again. Atlas isn't going to hang you out to dry, if that's what you're worried about. You're exactly the kind of pilot they want. Someone who actually knows how to fly, not just monitor autopilot systems." The flight back was smooth until they were an hour out from New York. That's when the weather turned. "Atlas 448, be advised, we're showing a line of severe thunderstorms moving across your route," the controller said. "Recommend deviation north or south." Malik pulled up the weather radar. The line of storms was massive, stretching from Virginia to Maine, tops reaching 50,000 feet. Deviating around it would add an hour to their flight time and put them into headwinds that would strain their fuel reserves. "What do you think?" Park asked. Malik studied the display. There was a gap in the line, maybe 30 miles wide, between two major cells. It would be turbulent, possibly severe, but it was passable. The conservative move was to deviate. The aggressive move was to thread the gap. 5 years ago, in a different cockpit, Malik had made an aggressive choice during bad weather. That choice had saved lives but cost him his career. Now, faced with a similar decision, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. "We deviate," he said firmly. "North route, even if it costs us time and fuel." "You sure? That gap looks wide enough." "I'm sure. Request north deviation, stay well clear of the cells." Park keyed the mic. "New York Center, Atlas 448, requesting deviation north of the weather line." Atlas 4488, approved as requested. Climb and maintain flight level 390, turn right heading 045. They climbed above the weather, adding 40 minutes to their flight time, but staying safely clear of the worst turbulence. When they finally touched down at JFK, they were low on fuel but intact. As they taxied to the cargo ramp, Park turned to Malik. "That was the right call, you know. I would have tried to shoot the gap, probably would have gotten us beat to hell by turbulence." "Experience," Malik said. "Sometimes the slower route is the smarter route." Is that what happened with Flight 1847? You made the slow, smart choice, and someone second-guessed you. Malik was quiet for a moment. "I made the aggressive choice because people's lives were at stake. But I learned something from that whole mess. Sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. So now I try to do things right in a way that doesn't give anyone ammunition to use against me later. That's a depressing lesson. It's a practical one. After shutdown, Malik made his way through customs and caught the train back to the city. It was late afternoon and Nia would still be at school. He had 2 hours to himself, a rare luxury. He stopped at a bookstore, bought Nia a picture book about Germany, then sat in a coffee shop and finally allowed himself to think about the lawsuit. His phone rang. Margaret Sullivan's name appeared on the screen. Margaret, hey. Malik, I heard about Gerald Whitmore's lawsuit. I wanted to give you a heads up. He's going after everyone. The airline, the maintenance company, even me and the rest of the crew. What's his claim? Negligent maintenance, inadequate crew training, and get this, that the airline should never have allowed an unauthorized person into the cockpit during the emergency. He's specifically naming you. Malik felt ice water run through his veins. He's naming me? His lawyers are arguing that you violated federal regulations and potentially made the situation more dangerous. It's complete garbage, but they're using it to strengthen their case against the airline. Can they do that? I wasn't even crew. I was just trying to help. They can argue anything they want. Doesn't mean it'll hold up in court, but it could get messy. The airline's legal team wants to depose you. Get your statement on record. They're on your side, but you need to be prepared. After they hung up, Malik sat in the coffee shop feeling the walls close in again. He'd been back in aviation for less than 3 months, had flown maybe 20 flights as captain, and already the past was reaching out to drag him down. The universe, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. He picked up Nia from school himself that afternoon, surprising her at the gate. She ran to him with her backpack bouncing, threw her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you're home early." "Landed a few hours ago. Thought I'd surprise you." They walked home hand in hand, Nia chattering about a test she'd aced and a boy who'd pulled her hair at recess. Normal kid stuff, the kind of ordinary problems that felt refreshing after the weight of lawsuits and depositions. "Can we get pizza for dinner?" Nia asked. "Sure. The good place or the cheap place?" "The good place." "You're a captain now. You can afford it." Malik laughed. "You know what? You're absolutely right." Over pizza that was probably too expensive but definitely worth it, Nia asked the question he'd been dreading. "Daddy, is something wrong?" "What makes you think that?" "You keep checking your phone, and you look sad." 7 years old, and she could read him like a book. Malik set down his phone and gave her his full attention. "You remember our trip to Iceland? The plane that had trouble landing? When you helped the pilots?" "Yeah. Well, someone from that flight is saying that the airline did something wrong, and they're saying I did something wrong too." "But you saved everyone." "I did. But sometimes people see things differently. They think maybe I shouldn't have been in the cockpit at all." Nia frowned, processing this. "That's stupid. If you didn't help, people could have died." "That's how I see it too. But there are rules about who's allowed to fly airplanes. And technically, I broke those rules. But it was an emergency." "I know, baby girl. Sometimes doing the right thing is complicated." She thought about this while demolishing another slice of pizza. "Mrs. Patterson says that rules are important, but knowing when to break them is wisdom." "Mrs. Patterson sounds pretty smart." "She is. She gave me an A on my book report." 3 days later, Malik sat in a conference room at a Manhattan law firm, facing 2 lawyers from the airline's legal team and a court stenographer. The deposition took 4 hours. They asked him to walk through every moment of the Iceland flight, from takeoff to landing. They wanted to know his exact words to the first officer, his assessment of the hydraulic failure, his reasoning for every suggestion he'd made. "Mr. Carter, did you at any point physically touch the flight controls?" asked the lead attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves. "No, ma'am. I was standing behind the first officer, observing the instruments and providing verbal guidance." "And did you have any official capacity on that flight? Were you deadheading crew, an air marshal, anything that would authorize your presence in the cockpit?" "No, I was a passenger." "So by entering the cockpit during flight, you violated 14 CFR 121.547. Is that correct?" Malik's jaw tightened. "I violated a regulation in order to prevent a catastrophic accident." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, technically, I violated that regulation." Reeves made a note. "And when you provided guidance to the first officer, Were you acting as pilot in command? No, the first officer remained pilot in command. I was advising only. But you were making decisions about aircraft operations, decisions that affected the safety of 200 passengers. I was providing expertise during an emergency. The first officer made the final decisions. Did he, though? Or did you essentially take command of that aircraft without authorization? Malik felt anger rising but forced it down. I helped a young pilot who was in over his head navigate an impossible situation. If you want to criminalize that, go ahead. But everyone on that airplane is alive because of what we did in that cockpit. The questions continued for another 2 hours. By the time they finished, Malik felt wrung out and defensive. Reeves walked him to the elevator. For what it's worth, you did the right thing, she said quietly. But Whitmore's lawyers are going to paint you as a rogue passenger who usurped command and potentially made things worse. We need your testimony to be airtight. It is airtight. I helped save that flight. I know, but we have to prove it, and we have to prove it in a way that satisfies federal regulators who care more about rules than results. The elevator doors opened. Malik stepped inside. One more thing, Reeves said. The FAA is reviewing the incident independently. They may decide to pursue enforcement action against you for the regulation violation. If that happens, it could affect your pilot certificate. The doors closed before Malik could respond. He walked through Manhattan in a daze, the city roaring around him, millions of people living their lives while his hung in the balance again. He found himself at Central Park and sat on a bench watching joggers and dog walkers and tourists taking selfies. Normal people doing normal things, unburdened by the weight of impossible choices. His phone rang. Captain Fletcher. Zhang told me about the deposition, Fletcher said without preamble. How bad was it? Pretty bad. They're painting me as some cowboy who took over the cockpit and violated federal regulations. Which you did, technically. I know that. Easy, son. I'm on your side. But you need to understand what you're up against. The FAA doesn't like gray areas. They like clear rules that were either followed or broken. What you did was heroic, but it was also technically illegal. They're going to have to reconcile those two facts. So what do I do? You tell the truth. You explain your reasoning, and you hope that the investigators are reasonable people who understand that rules exist to serve safety, not the other way around. Fletcher paused. But Malik, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this doesn't go your way. The FAA could suspend your certificate. Atlas might have to put you on administrative leave. This could get ugly. I just got my life back together. I can't lose this again. Then fight. Fight like hell, but fight smart. Get your own lawyer, not just the airlines. Document everything. And for the love of aviation, don't talk to anyone about this case without legal counsel present. Malik hung up and sat in the gathering darkness, watching the city lights come on one by one. He thought about Nia, about the promises he'd made, about the precarious life they'd built. He thought about that moment in the Iceland cockpit when he'd had to choose between following rules and saving lives. He'd make the same choice again. He knew that with certainty. But knowing you'd make the same choice didn't make the consequences any easier to bear. His phone buzzed with the text from Nia. Daddy, when are you coming home? Grandma made pot roast. Malik smiled despite everything. On my way, baby girl. Save me some. The following week brought more complications. A reporter from Aviation Weekly somehow got Malik's number and called asking for an interview about the Iceland incident and subsequent legal fallout. Malik declined, but the reporter published an article anyway, citing anonymous sources and speculating about whether civilian passengers should ever be allowed to assist flight crews during emergencies. The article went semi-viral in aviation circles. Online forums debated Malik's actions. Some pilots hailed him as a hero. Others argued he dangerously exceeded his authority. A few pointed out that the same regulators who would investigate him had themselves commended civilian medical personnel who'd helped sick passengers during flights. The difference, one forum post noted, is that doctors helping sick passengers don't touch the flight controls or advise pilots on aircraft operations. Carter crossed a line, however well-intentioned. Malik forced himself to stop reading the forums. Nothing good came from obsessing over what strangers on the internet thought. But the controversy was starting to affect his work. On a flight to Hong Kong, his first officer, a quiet man named Thompson, mentioned he'd read the article. Can I ask you something? Thompson said once they were at cruise altitude. Sure. Would you do it again? If you were on a flight as a passenger and something went wrong, would you step in? Malik had to think about that. The honest answer was complicated. I don't know, he finally said. Part of me wants to say absolutely, without hesitation. But the smart part of my brain says I should stay in my seat and let the crew handle it, even if I think I could help. That's depressing. That's reality. Sometimes the system punishes the people who try to do the right thing. Is that why you left aviation the first time? The system punished you? Yeah, I saved a flight during a storm and the investigation decided I'd used questionable judgment. Never mind that everyone landed safely. They cared more about procedure than results. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. I read about Flight 1847. You made a difficult call in bad conditions and you got everyone home. That should have been the end of the story. Should have been, wasn't. For what it's worth, I'm glad you came back. We need more pilots who actually know how to fly instead of just babysitting autopilot systems. The investigation dragged on through the winter. Malik flew his routes, came home to Nia, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy while lawyers and federal investigators dissected every decision he'd made in that Iceland cockpit. The FAA sent him formal notice that they were reviewing his actions for potential certificate action. His lawyer, a former pilot-turned-aviation attorney named Marcus Webb, assured him this was standard procedure, but advised him to prepare for the worst. They might suspend you for 90 days, Webb said over the phone, or they might issue a warning letter, or they might do nothing. The FAA is unpredictable when it comes to cases like this. Cases like this meaning what? Cases where someone clearly violated regulations but had excellent reasons for doing so. The FAA doesn't like to set precedents that rules can be broken even in emergencies, but they also don't want to be seen as punishing heroes. So I'm stuck in limbo. Essentially, yes. Nia's 8th birthday came in February. Malik had been home for 3 days straight, a rare scheduling gift, and he'd used the time to plan something special. They went ice skating at Rockefeller Center, had lunch at a restaurant where the servers sang Happy Birthday in 4 languages, and finished the day at a Broadway matinee of a show Nia had been begging to see. That night, as Malik tucked her into bed surrounded by birthday presents, Nia looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, are you in trouble?" He could have deflected, could have told her everything was fine, but they'd built their relationship on honesty, and he wasn't going to start lying now. Maybe a little bit. Remember how I told you that some people think I did the wrong thing on that Iceland flight? Well, they're trying to decide if I should be punished for it. But you saved everyone. I know, but I also broke some rules, and sometimes breaking rules has consequences even when you had good reasons. That's not fair. Life isn't always fair, baby girl, but you know what? Even if they decide to punish me, even if I have to stop flying for a while, we're going to be okay, because we have each other, and that's what really matters. Nia hugged him tight. I don't want you to be sad again like you were before. I won't be. I promise. I'm stronger now. We both are. The FAA's decision came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Malik was in the middle of pre-flight checks for a flight to London when his phone buzzed with an email from Marcus Webb. The subject line read, FAA decision. Please call immediately. Malik's hand started shaking. He excused himself from the cockpit, told Park he needed 5 minutes, and found a quiet corner of the cargo facility to call his lawyer. What's the verdict? Malik asked without preamble. They're issuing a warning letter and a 60-day certificate suspension. The world tilted. 60 days? Could have been worse, could have been revocation. The warning letter goes in your file permanently, and the suspension means you can't exercise pilot privileges for 2 months starting next week. But after that, you're cleared to fly again. Atlas is going to fire me. Actually, they're not. I spoke with Zhang this morning. They're putting you on paid administrative leave during the suspension. You keep your benefits, you keep your seniority number, and you come back to work when the FAA clears you. Malik leaned against the cold metal wall of the cargo building, trying to process this. They're standing by me? They are. Zhang said, and I quote, Carter did the right thing in an impossible situation, and we're not going to abandon him for it. I need to sit down. Malik, listen to me. This is actually the best outcome we could have hoped for. A warning letter is nothing. Half the pilots in the country have one in their file. The suspension sucks, but it's temporary. You'll be back flying in 2 months with your career intact. That's a win. After they hung up, Malik sat in the cargo facility for a long time, watching forklifts move pallets and ground crew service aircraft. 2 months. 60 days without flying. 60 days to second-guess every decision, to wonder if he'd made the right choice in Iceland, to live with the consequences of doing what he thought was right. He made his way back to the cockpit where Park was finishing the pre-flight checklist. "Everything okay?" she asked. FAA decision came through. 60-day suspension. Park's face fell. "Malik, I'm sorry. Could have been worse. At least I get to come back." "When does it start?" "Next week." "Then let's make this flight count. One more trip across the pond before you're grounded." They flew to London through clear skies and calm air, the kind of perfect conditions that made flying feel almost meditative. Malik savored every moment, the weight of the yoke in his hand, the sound of the engines, the vast openness of the Atlantic below them. In a week, he'd be grounded again, watching aircraft from the ground instead of commanding them through the sky. But for now, in this moment, he was exactly where he belonged. Park must have sensed his mood because she stayed quiet, letting him fly, letting him have this. When they finally touched down at Heathrow, her landing was so smooth that passengers applauded. "Show off," Malik said with a smile. "Learn from the best." His last flight before suspension was a short hop from New York to Memphis, delivering engine parts and medical supplies. The first officer was a young guy fresh out of training, nervous and eager to please. Malik let him fly most of the leg, offering guidance and corrections, teaching the way Fletcher had taught him years ago. "Captain, can I ask you something?" the kid said as they descended into Memphis. "Sure." "Is it true you're being suspended for helping during an emergency?" "Yeah, it's true." "That's messed up." "It's complicated, but yeah, it feels pretty messed up." "For what it's worth, sir, I think you're the kind of pilot I want to be. Someone who knows the rules, but also knows when people matter more than procedures." Malik felt something catch in his throat. "Just remember to be smarter about it than I was. Find ways to help that don't violate federal regulations." After landing, Malik cleared out his personal items from the crew room and said goodbye to the operations staff who'd become familiar faces over the past few months. They all knew about the suspension, and they all shook his hand and told him they'd see him in 60 days. The flight home as a passenger felt surreal. Malik sat in economy, cramped and uncomfortable, watching the flight attendants serve drinks and the pilots flying up front doing the job he'd be locked out of for 2 months. Beside him, a businessman worked on his laptop, completely oblivious to the small tragedy unfolding in the seat next to him. Nia was waiting at the apartment when he got home, pizza already ordered, his mother having stayed to help with dinner. "So it's official?" his mother asked quietly while Nia was in the bathroom. "Starts tomorrow, 60 days. "And you're okay?" Malik thought about that. Was he okay? He'd lost his career once and clawed his way back only to have it taken away again, albeit temporarily. He'd done the right thing and been punished for it. He'd saved lives and been told he'd violated regulations. But he was home. His daughter was safe, he had a job to return to and people who believed in him. And in 60 days, he'd be back in the cockpit where he belonged. "Yeah, Mom," he said finally. "I think I'm okay." The first week of suspension felt like falling. Malik woke up every morning at 4 a.m. out of habit, his body still programmed for early flights, only to remember he had nowhere to go. He'd lie in bed listening to aircraft pass overhead on their approach to JFK, each one a reminder of what he'd temporarily lost. Nia noticed the change immediately. Her father was home every morning when she woke up, made her breakfast, walked her to school. She didn't complain, but Malik could see the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Kids were perceptive that way. They knew when adults were struggling, even if they didn't understand why. "Daddy, is this like a vacation?" she asked on the third morning. "Sort of. I have some time off from work. But you don't seem happy about it." Malik poured orange juice into her glass, measuring his words carefully. "Sometimes people need breaks from work even when they don't want them. It gives them time to think and get ready to come back stronger." "Are you going to come back stronger?" "I'm going to try, baby girl." By the second week, the restlessness became unbearable. Malik tried to fill his days with productive activity, deep cleaning the apartment, organizing paperwork that had been neglected for years, finally fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But none of it filled the void left by flying. He'd been back in the cockpit for only a few months, but it had become part of him again, essential as breathing. Without it, he felt incomplete. His lawyer called with updates on the Whitmore lawsuit. The airline was negotiating a settlement, trying to avoid the publicity of a trial. Gerald Whitmore's lawyers were pushing for a significant payout, using Malik's presence in the cockpit as evidence of the airline's negligence. They're arguing that if the situation was bad enough to require an unauthorized passenger to assist, then clearly the crew was inadequately trained, Marcus Webb explained over the phone. That's insane. The first officer was fine until multiple systems failed simultaneously. I know, but it plays well to a jury, this narrative of a desperate passenger having to save the day because the real pilots couldn't handle it. So I'm being used as proof that the airline was negligent, even though what I did literally saved everyone's lives? Welcome to aviation litigation. Logic rarely applies. Malik hung up feeling angry and helpless. He'd spent his whole career doing the right thing, making the hard calls, putting safety first. And somehow that had become a liability, something for lawyers to twist into evidence of wrongdoing. He needed to move, to do something physical before the anger consumed him. He grabbed his running shoes and hit the streets, pounding out mile after mile through the neighborhood. The rhythm of his feet on pavement became meditative, pushing out the circular thoughts about lawsuits and suspensions and the injustice of it all. He ran past the warehouse where he'd worked during his exile from aviation. The building looked smaller now, less imposing. Through the windows, he could see workers moving pallets, the same repetitive motion he'd performed for years. That version of himself felt like a different person, broken, defeated, resigned to a smaller life. At least now he was fighting. At least now he hadn't given up. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Sullivan. Heard about the suspension. Want to grab coffee? I'm in New York for recurrent training. They met at a diner near LaGuardia, the kind of place that catered to flight crews between trips. Margaret looked tired but determined, still wearing her uniform, clearly having come straight from the training center. 60 days, she said after they'd ordered. That's harsh, but survivable. Doesn't feel survivable. I know, but it is. I got suspended once back in the 90s. 90 days for refusing to fly an aircraft I thought was unsafe. Turned out I was right. They found a cracked spar during the inspection I forced them to do, but that didn't matter. I'd refused a direct order, so they suspended me. What did you do? Waited it out. Stayed current on the ground as best I could. Read every manual, studied every procedure. When I came back, I was sharper than I'd been before. Used the time instead of letting it use me. Malik stirred his coffee, thinking about that. I don't know how to use this time. I just feel stuck. Then get unstuck. You're a captain with thousands of hours and a gift for teaching. Go to the flight school at Teterboro. Offer to volunteer as a ground instructor. Stay sharp. Stay connected. Don't let 2 months turn into permanent disconnection. It was good advice. That afternoon, Malik drove to Teterboro Airport and walked into the flight school Margaret had mentioned. The chief instructor was a gruff man in his 60s named Ed Morrison, who'd been teaching people to fly for 40 years. So you're the guy from Iceland, Morrison said after Malik introduced himself. News really does travel in this industry. Like wildfire. Also heard you got suspended for it. That's bureaucratic nonsense, but I guess you know that already. Morrison leaned back in his chair. What do you want from me? I want to teach. I've got 60 days with nothing to do and I'm going crazy. I'm not asking for money, just a chance to stay connected to aviation while I wait this out. Morrison studied him for a long moment. You current on instrument instruction? Was before the suspension, but I can brush up. Do that. Come back next week and we'll see if you're any good. If you are, I'll put you in front of students. If you're not, I'll tell you to your face and send you home. Malik grinned. Fair enough. He spent the next 5 days buried in instrument flying procedures, relearning the nuances of approach plates and holding patterns and IFAR regulations. It felt good to study again, to engage his mind with technical challenges instead of dwelling on the injustice of his situation. When he returned to the flight school, Morrison put him in a simulator with a nervous student pilot who was struggling with instrument approaches. Malik talked the kid through a series of ILS approaches, breaking down each step, explaining the theory behind the procedure. "You're thinking of the approach as one big, complicated thing," Malik told the student. "But it's really just a series of small, simple steps. Intercept the localizer, maintain the heading, watch your descent rate. Every good landing starts with a good approach, and every good approach is just you doing the next right thing in sequence." The student nailed the next approach. Morrison, watching from the instructor station, gave Malik a slight nod. "You'll do," Morrison said afterward. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, you're mine. I've got a dozen students who need help with instrument work. You teach them, you stay sharp, everybody wins." Teaching filled some of the void, but not all of it. At night, after Nia was asleep, Malik would stand at the window and watch aircraft on approach to LaGuardia, their landing lights cutting through the darkness. He'd track their descent, mentally flying the approach himself, imagining the call-outs and corrections and the satisfaction of touching down smoothly. 3 weeks into the suspension, the Iceland lawsuit took a dramatic turn. Gerald Whitmore's lawyers released a statement to the media claiming they had evidence that the airline had known about maintenance issues with the aircraft before the flight and had allowed it to fly anyway. The story made national news. Malik's phone exploded with calls from reporters wanting comment. He declined them all on Marcus Webb's advice, but the damage was done. Suddenly, the Iceland incident was back in the public eye, and Malik's role in it was being dissected in think pieces and cable news segments. "Former pilot turned passenger saves doomed flight," read one headline. "Aviation experts question whether civilians should ever enter cockpit," read another. The worst was an opinion piece in a major newspaper arguing that Malik's actions, while well-intentioned, had set a dangerous precedent. "What's to stop every armchair pilot with a few flight simulator hours from rushing the cockpit during turbulence?" the author wrote. "Carter may have been qualified, but his actions undermined the authority of the flight crew and violated regulations that exist for good reason." Nia came home from school upset one afternoon. One of her classmates had seen the news coverage and had asked if her dad was the man who'd almost gotten everyone killed by taking over an airplane. "I told Tommy he was stupid and that you saved everyone," Nia said, trying to be brave but clearly shaken. "But then Mrs. Patterson said I couldn't call people stupid even if they were being stupid, and I got in trouble." Malik pulled her close. "I'm sorry this is affecting you, baby girl. I'm sorry people are saying things that aren't true." "Why do they say you did something wrong when you helped?" "Because people get scared when someone breaks rules, even if they had a good reason. Rules make people feel safe. When someone breaks them, it reminds everyone that the world is more complicated than they want it to be. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But we don't get to choose what's fair. We only get to choose how we respond to it." The next day, Malik got a call from an unexpected source, the first officer from Flight 7243, the young pilot he'd helped during the emergency. "Mr. Carter, this is Ryan Mitchell. I was the first officer on the Iceland flight." "Ryan, I remember. How are you doing?" "I'm okay. Still flying, working on my captain upgrade. But I've been following the news coverage, and I needed to call you. What they're saying, that you undermined the crew, that you made things more dangerous, it's complete garbage." "I appreciate that." "No, you don't understand. I need to tell someone officially. The airline's lawyers asked me not to make statements to the media. But I can't stay quiet while people trash you for saving my life and everyone else's. You didn't undermine me. You saved me. I was 28 years old, 7 years out of flight school, and I'd never dealt with anything like that. When those hydraulic systems failed, I froze. I completely froze." Malik could hear the emotion in the younger pilot's voice. "You didn't freeze," Malik said gently. "You kept the aircraft under control. You made the right calls. Because you told me what the right calls were when you came into that cockpit, I was 30 seconds from declaring an emergency and ditching in the ocean because I didn't know what else to do. You walked me through differential thrust, split controls, using the trim to compensate for the failed hydraulics. You saved that flight, Mr. Carter, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." And true to his word, Ryan Mitchell gave an interview to Aviation Weekly the next day. He spoke candidly about the emergency, about his own panic and inexperience, about Malik's calm expertise under pressure. People want to make this about regulations and unauthorized cockpit access, Ryan told the reporter. But regulations exist to keep people safe, but Mr. Carter kept us safe. If the FAA wants to suspend him for that, fine. But history is going to remember him as the man who saved Flight 7243, not the man who violated 14 CFR 121.547. The interview changed something in the public narrative. Other pilots started speaking up, sharing stories of times when unconventional decisions had saved flights. A retired NTSB investigator wrote an op-ed arguing that the FAA's response to Malik's actions was overly punitive and would discourage future Good Samaritans from helping during emergencies. Margaret Sullivan organized a petition among flight attendants supporting Malik. Within a week, it had over 3,000 signatures from crew members across a dozen airlines. But the most unexpected support came from an unlikely source. Captain Holland, the pilot who'd suffered the heart attack during the Iceland flight, gave an interview from his home in Connecticut where he was recovering. "I was unconscious for most of the emergency," Holland told the reporter, "but I've read the cockpit voice recorder transcript. I've talked to my first officer, and I've flown with enough pilots in 32 years to recognize exceptional airmanship when I see it. Malik Carter is exactly the kind of pilot I'd want in the left seat if my aircraft was falling apart. The fact that he was sitting in coach instead of the cockpit during that emergency is aviation's loss, not its gain." The interview aired on a Friday evening. By Saturday morning, #support. Captain Carter was trending on social media. The aviation community, notorious for eating its own, had rallied around one of their own instead. David John called Malik that weekend. "Have you seen the news coverage? Hard to miss it. The airline's position has shifted. We're still negotiating the Whitmore settlement, but we're now including language that specifically defends your actions. We're also drafting a formal commendation to go in your personnel file. What you did saved lives and saved this company millions in potential losses. I appreciate that, but it doesn't change the FAA suspension." Actually, it might. Your lawyer should have told you. The FAA is reviewing their decision based on new information. The petition, the pilot statements, Holland's interview, it's all creating pressure for them to reconsider. Malik's hands started shaking. Reconsider meaning what? Meaning possibly reducing the suspension or converting it to a warning letter only. No promises, but there's movement. After they hung up, Malik sat in stunned silence. For weeks, he'd been living in a world where doing the right thing meant punishment, where saving lives meant losing his career. The possibility that the narrative might shift felt almost too fragile to hope for. That night, he took Nia out for dinner at her favorite burger place. She ordered the biggest milkshake on the menu and told him about a science project she was planning. "We have to build something that flies," she explained, "like a kite or a paper airplane or something. But I want to make something better, something that really flies." "What were you thinking? A drone? Or maybe a model airplane with a motor?" Malik smiled. "How about we build a glider? I'll teach you about lift and drag and how wings work. Can we make it actually fly? Like really fly, not just glide? We can try. That's what aviation is all about, trying to make things fly that probably shouldn't." They spent the next 2 weeks building the glider in the evenings after school. Malik showed Nia how to shape the wings, how to balance the weight, how to adjust the control surfaces for stable flight. She was a quick study, asking questions that showed she was really understanding the principles. "Daddy, why do some airplanes have their wings on top and some on bottom?" "Good question. It's about stability and how the airplane is designed to be used. High wings are more stable but harder to load cargo into. Low wings are less stable but better for high-speed flight." "Which one is better?" "Depends on what you're trying to do. There's no perfect airplane, just the right airplane for the right job." On launch day, they took the glider to a park on a hill overlooking the city. Malik checked the wind, made some final adjustments, and handed the glider to Nia. "You built it," he said. "You should be the one to launch it." She held the glider carefully, checking the angle like he'd taught her. Then she pulled her arm back and threw it forward with all her strength. The glider caught the wind, lifted, soared out over the park in a graceful arc. It flew for almost 30 seconds, covering maybe 100 yards before settling gently onto the grass. Other families in the park applauded. Nia turned to Malik with the biggest smile he'd ever seen. "We did it! We made it fly!" "You did it, baby girl. You're a natural engineer." They retrieved the glider and flew it a dozen more times, each launch a small triumph. Watching his daughter's joy, seeing her understand the magic of flight in a concrete way, Malik felt something shift inside him. Even if the suspension stood, even if the FAA never reinstated him, he'd given his daughter this gift, the knowledge that flight was possible, that humans could build things that defied gravity through understanding and effort. That evening, Marcus Webb called with news. "The FAA is amending their decision. They're reducing your suspension to 30 days, which you've already served. You're cleared to return to flight status immediately." Malik couldn't speak. "Malik, did you hear me? You're cleared to fly." "I heard you. I don't know what to say." The public pressure worked. The pilot's statements, the crew petition, Holland's interview, it all added up. The FAA doesn't want to be seen as punishing someone for heroism, especially when the aviation community is united in supporting you. After the call, Malik stood at the window watching aircraft land at LaGuardia. But this time, instead of watching from the outside, he was watching as a pilot again. Tomorrow he'd call Atlas and let them know he was ready to return to work. Tomorrow he'd start planning his first flight back. But tonight, he just stood there feeling the weight lift off his shoulders, feeling like he could breathe again. Nia appeared beside him, following his gaze to the aircraft outside. "You're going back, aren't you?" she said. "Yeah, baby girl. I'm going back." "Good. You belong up there." She was right. He did belong up there. Not because someone had given him permission, but because he'd earned it through skill and judgment and the courage to make hard choices when lives were at stake. His first flight back was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, a familiar route to Frankfurt that he'd flown a dozen times before. Malik arrived at the cargo facility early, savoring the familiar routine of pre-flight planning and crew briefing. His first officer was Lisa Park, who greeted him with a huge smile. "Welcome back, Captain. It's good to have you in the left seat again." "It's good to be back." They ran through the pre-flight checks with comfortable efficiency, two pilots who'd flown together enough to develop an easy rhythm. As they pushed back from the gate, Malik felt that familiar rush of anticipation and responsibility. "Atlas 447, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 4 left," the tower controller said. "Cleared for takeoff, 4 left, Atlas 447, Malik replied. He advanced the throttles and the massive aircraft began to roll, faster and faster until the runway lights were a blur. V1, rotate, lift off. New York fell away below them, and they climbed into the morning sky. "Nice rotation," Park said. "Thanks. Feels good to be flying again." "I bet. 30 days must have felt like forever." "It did. But I learned something during the suspension." "What's that?" Malik thought about the glider project with Nia, the teaching at the flight school, the outpouring of support from the aviation community. He thought about Margaret Sullivan's advice to use the time instead of letting it use him. "I learned that being a pilot isn't just about flying. It's about the knowledge, the community, the commitment to safety. Even when I wasn't in the cockpit, I was still a pilot. Nothing could take that away from me." They flew into the sunrise, crossing the Atlantic while the world below slowly woke. Somewhere back in New York, Nia was probably getting ready for school, maybe telling her friends that her dad was flying to Germany. Somewhere in Iceland, a Boeing 767 that had nearly crashed was back in service after extensive repairs. And somewhere in Washington, FA. Officials were probably still debating whether they'd made the right call in reducing Malik's suspension. But up here, at 37,000 feet with an aircraft responding perfectly to his inputs and a good first officer by his side, none of that mattered. What mattered was the next decision, the next procedure, the next small choice that would keep this flight safe. "You know what I realized during all this?" Malik said after they'd leveled off at cruise. "What's that?" "I spent 5 years thinking the system had broken me, thinking that one bad investigation had destroyed my career and my confidence. But I was never broken. I just believed I was because people kept telling me I was. And now? Now I know the truth. I'm a damn good pilot. And I always was." Park smiled. "Welcome back, Captain Carter. For real this time." The flight continued through clear skies and calm air, routine in the best possible way. When they landed in Frankfurt 12 hours later, Malik's landing was smooth and centered, exactly the way he'd been taught decades ago. As they taxied to the cargo ramp, Park said, "You know the Iceland first officer, Ryan Mitchell? He got his captain upgrade last week. He told the Czech airman that he wanted to be the kind of captain you were in that cockpit, calm under pressure, focused on solutions, willing to make the hard calls." Malik felt something warm in his chest. He's going to be a great captain, because you showed him how. After shutdown, Malik made his way through the Frankfurt airport to the crew hotel. His phone buzzed with messages. Nia sending him a picture of the A+ she'd gotten on her glider project, his mother checking that he'd landed safely, David Zhang congratulating him on a smooth return to flight status. And one message from Margaret Sullivan. "Heard you're back in the air. Knew you would be. Told you that you belonged in the sky. Now stop proving me right and just fly." Malik smiled and pocketed his phone. Tomorrow he'd fly back to New York. In 3 days he'd have another trip, this time to Hong Kong. The rhythm of his life as a pilot would resume. The early mornings and long flights, the hotel rooms and airport terminals, the constant movement between earth and sky. But he'd never take it for granted again. Every flight was a gift. Every landing was a small miracle. And every time he walked into a cockpit, he'd remember that he'd earned his place there through skill and judgment and the courage to do the right thing even when the cost was high. He belonged to the sky. And this time, nothing was going to take that away from him. 3 months after returning to flight status, Malik was sitting in the crew lounge at JFK when David Zhang walked in with a manila folder under his arm and an expression that Malik couldn't quite read. "Got a minute, Captain?" Zhang asked. Malik set down his coffee. "Sure. What's up?" Zhang sat across from him and slid the folder across the table. "The Whitmore lawsuit settled yesterday. Confidential terms, but it's done. The airline's legal team wanted you to know that your testimony and the supporting statements from the crew were instrumental in keeping the settlement reasonable. Whitmore's lawyers were pushing for 8 figures. We settled for a fraction of that." "That's good news." "There's more. The airline wants to formally recognize what you did. We're proposing a new protocol for situations where off-duty or non-operating crew members can provide assistance during emergencies. We're calling it the Carter Protocol." Malik stared at him. "You're naming it after me?" "The FAA is reviewing it for approval, but yes. The idea is to create clear guidelines for when and how qualified individuals can assist flight crews without violating existing regulations. Your situation exposed a gap in our procedures. We're fixing that gap." "I don't know what to say." Zhang smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep flying the way you fly. That's all we ask." He stood to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. We're sending you to the training center next month for captain upgrade on the 777. You've earned it." After Zhang left, Malik sat alone in the crew lounge, turning over this new information. A protocol named after him. A 777 type rating. Formal recognition instead of punishment. The world had a strange way of correcting itself sometimes. His phone buzzed with the text from Nia. "Daddy, can you come to career day at school next month? I want to show everyone what you do." Malik smiled and typed back, "Absolutely, baby girl. Wouldn't miss it." Career Day turned out to be more elaborate than Malik expected. The school had converted the gymnasium into a showcase of different professions. Doctors, lawyers, firefighters, even a marine biologist who'd brought a small shark in a tank. Nia had insisted that Malik wear his full captain's uniform, and she'd made a poster board with photos of him in the cockpit and pictures of the aircraft he flew. "This is my dad," Nia announced to her class with obvious pride. "He's an airline captain. He flies cargo planes all over the world. And one time, he saved a whole airplane full of people when something went wrong." 25 second graders looked at Malik with wide eyes. "What went wrong?" one kid asked. Malik knelt down to be at their eye level. The airplane had some mechanical problems, and the pilots needed help figuring out what to do. "I was just a passenger on that flight, but I used to be a pilot, so I went up to the cockpit and helped them land safely." "Were you scared?" a little girl in the front row asked. "Terrified," Malik admitted. "But being scared is okay. What matters is what you do even when you're scared. I was scared, but I also knew I had skills that could help, so I used them." "Did everyone live?" another kid asked. "Everyone lived, And you know what I learned? Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is help someone else even when you're scared yourself. The questions continued for 30 minutes. What's the biggest plane you've flown? How fast do airplanes go? Can you fly upside down? Have you ever seen a UFO? Malik answered each one patiently, watching Nia beam with pride every time he spoke. After the presentation, Mrs. Patterson pulled him aside. That was wonderful, Mr. Carter. Nia talks about you constantly. She's so proud of what you do. She's a great kid. She is. And she's lucky to have a father who shows her that doing the right thing matters more than following rules blindly. That's a lesson a lot of adults haven't learned. On the drive home, Nia was practically vibrating with excitement. Did you see Tommy's face when you talked about the emergency landing? He couldn't believe it. I saw. He looked pretty impressed. He said his dad just does accounting and it's boring. I told him all jobs are important, but yours is cooler. Malik laughed. Well, accounting keeps the world running too. We need people doing all kinds of work. I know, but I still think flying is coolest. That evening, after Nia was asleep, Malik received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Interview request, Aviation Safety Foundation." The email was from a woman named Dr. Patricia Henderson, director of the Aviation Safety Foundation, a non-profit organization that studied aircraft accidents and promoted safety improvements across the industry. Dear Captain Carter, the email read, the foundation is conducting a comprehensive study on crew resource management and emergency decision-making. Your experience during the Iceland incident represents a unique case study in unconventional problem-solving under pressure. We would like to interview you for our research and potentially feature your case in our annual safety symposium. Please let me know if you'd be willing to participate. Malik read the email 3 times. For months, he'd been trying to move past the Iceland incident, to let it fade into background noise. But maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe the experience had value beyond his personal story. Maybe sharing what he'd learned could actually help prevent future accidents. He typed a response. I'd be honored to participate. When would you like to schedule the interview? The interview took place 2 weeks later at the Foundation's offices in Washington. Dr. Henderson was a former airline captain herself, which immediately put Malik at ease. She understood the pressures of the cockpit in a way that non-pilots never could. Walk me through your decision-making process, she said after the preliminary questions. From the moment you realized something was wrong to the moment you entered the cockpit. Malik thought back to that night over the Atlantic. The first thing I noticed was the aircraft's handling. I've flown enough hours to know what normal feels like, and this wasn't normal. The way we were wallowing, the corrections the pilots were making, I could tell they were fighting the aircraft. But you didn't immediately go to the cockpit. No, my first instinct was to stay in my seat and trust the crew to handle it. That's what passengers are supposed to do. But when the flight attendant came through asking if anyone had flight experience, I knew the situation was worse than I'd thought. What made you decide to help? Malik paused, remembering Nia's face, the weight of responsibility. My daughter was with me. She was 7 years old and terrified, and I realized that if I had knowledge that could save her life and everyone else's, staying in my seat would be cowardice, not following procedure. Dr. Henderson made notes. That's interesting. So your motivation was primarily parental, not professional? Both. As a father, I had to protect my daughter. As a pilot, I had a responsibility to use my skills if they could prevent a disaster. Those two things aren't separate. They're the same thing. And when you got to the cockpit, the first officer was overwhelmed. Not incompetent, just overwhelmed. Multiple hydraulic failures, degraded flight controls, a captain down with a medical emergency. He was facing conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. My job wasn't to take over. It was to give him the support and knowledge he needed to save that aircraft himself. Which you did. Which we did together. I didn't land that plane, he did. I just helped him remember that he could. The interview lasted 3 hours. Dr. Henderson asked detailed questions about specific technical decisions, about how Malik had communicated under pressure, about what training might have better prepared the first officer for that scenario. By the end, Malik felt wrung out, but also oddly energized. This was the first time anyone had asked him about Iceland not to assign blame, but to understand what had worked and why. One final question, Dr. Henderson said. If you could go back to that moment, knowing everything that would happen afterward, the suspension, the lawsuit, the media attention, would you still enter that cockpit? Malik didn't hesitate. Absolutely, without question. Why? Because doing the right thing has to matter more than protecting yourself. If I'd stayed in my seat and that aircraft had crashed, I'd have had to live the rest of my life knowing I could have prevented it. No career is worth that weight. Dr. Henderson smiled. That's what I needed to hear. Thank you, Captain Carter. The Foundation's annual safety symposium was held in Atlanta 6 weeks later. Malik flew in on his day off, wearing his uniform, feeling nervous about speaking in front of hundreds of aviation professionals. Dr. Henderson had assured him it would be conversational, not a formal speech, but that didn't calm his nerves. The symposium was massive. Over 500 pilots, engineers, safety inspectors, and airline executives filling a hotel ballroom. Malik sat in the front row while Dr. Henderson gave the introduction. Our next case study challenges us to think about the boundaries between regulation and common sense, she began. It asks us to consider what we would do if faced with a choice between following rules and saving lives. Please welcome Captain Malik Carter. The applause was warm and sustained. Malik took the stage and faced the crowd, seeing familiar faces scattered throughout. Margaret Sullivan in the third row, Captain Fletcher near the back, even Ryan Mitchell sitting with a group of younger pilots. Dr. Henderson joined him on stage with 2 chairs set up for what she'd called a fireside chat format. Captain Carter, let's start with the basic question everyone wants answered. What was going through your mind when that flight attendant asked if anyone had flight experience? Malik settled into his chair. Honestly, pure fear. I knew that question meant something had gone very wrong, and I had a split second to decide whether to identify myself or stay quiet. What made you speak up? My daughter. She was sitting next to me, terrified, and I couldn't look her in the eye if I sat there with knowledge that could save her and didn't use it. They talked for 45 minutes, Dr. Henderson guiding the conversation through technical details and decision-making frameworks. But the most powerful moment came when she asked about the aftermath. You were suspended by the FAA for helping during this emergency. How did that feel? Like being punished for doing the right thing, Malik said honestly. I'd spent my whole career prioritizing safety, and suddenly that was being used against me. It felt like the system I'd devoted my life to had betrayed me. And now? How do you feel about it now? Malik looked out at the audience, at all these aviation professionals who dedicated their lives to keeping people safe. I understand why the regulations exist. I understand that we can't have a free-for-all where anyone can enter the cockpit claiming to help. But I also think we need to be smart enough to recognize that rules are tools, not religions. They exist to serve safety, not the other way around. The applause when he finished was thunderous. Afterward, dozens of pilots approached him to shake his hand and share their own stories of times when they'd had to choose between procedure and survival. A young first officer told him she'd used his Iceland case as an example in her captain upgrade training. A senior Czech airman said he was incorporating lessons from Malik's experience into his emergency training syllabus. But the most meaningful conversation came from Captain Fletcher, who pulled Malik aside near the hotel bar after the formal sessions had ended. You know what I'm proudest of, Fletcher said. What's that, sir? I taught you how to fly, but you taught yourself how to be brave. That's not something anyone can train into you. You either have it or you don't. You have it. Malik felt emotion tighten his throat. I learned it from you, from watching you make hard calls and stand by them. Maybe. But you made it your own, and now you're teaching the next generation. That's the best legacy any pilot can have. Flying back to New York the next day, Malik reflected on how completely his life had transformed. 2 years ago, he'd been a warehouse worker with no future beyond the next shift. 1 year ago, he'd been fighting to reclaim his career from an investigation that had nearly destroyed him. Now he was being held up as an example of good decision-making, asked to share his experience with the broader aviation community, recognized for the very thing that had once been used to punish him. The 777 training course started the following month. Malik spent 6 weeks immersed in ground school and simulator sessions, learning the systems and procedures of one of the most sophisticated aircraft in commercial aviation. The training was intense, but he loved every minute of it. His Czech airman for the final evaluation was a captain named Sarah Torres, who had a reputation for being thorough but fair. She put Malik through a series of increasingly complex scenarios: engine failures, electrical problems, even a simulated cabin fire. Malik handled each one methodically, working through checklists, coordinating with his simulated first officer, making the calls that kept the aircraft safe. The final scenario was designed to be nearly impossible. Torres programmed in multiple simultaneous failures at the worst possible moment, on final approach in bad weather with minimum fuel. It was the kind of situation where there were no good options, only less bad ones. Malik assessed the situation quickly. They couldn't make the original airport with degraded systems and fuel state, but there was a smaller airport 10 miles to the east with better weather and a longer runway. It meant deviating from the approach and flying on instruments through clouds with compromised navigation systems, but it was the best chance they had. Declaring emergency, Malik said calmly. Request immediate vector to alternate airport. He flew the approach manually, trusting his instruments and his training, fighting the simulator's artificial turbulence and systems failures. The landing was hard but centered, exactly the kind of survivable touchdown that turns disasters into stories people tell afterward. Torres shut down the simulator and turned to him with an appraising look. You've done that before. Something like it, over Iceland. I know. I read the case file before your check ride. You made similar decisions then, unconventional but effective. That's the mark of a pilot who understands that the goal isn't to follow procedures perfectly. It's to bring everyone home alive. Did I pass? Torres smiled. With flying colors. Welcome to the 777, Captain Carter. Malik's first flight as a 777 captain was a cargo run from New York to Tokyo with a fuel stop in Anchorage. The aircraft was massive compared to the 767s he'd been flying, with systems so automated that the joke was the flight deck crew consisted of a pilot and a dog, the pilot to watch the systems and the dog to bite the pilot if he tried to touch anything. But underneath all the automation, it was still just an airplane. It responded to the same laws of physics, required the same fundamental skills. And when Malik lifted off from JFK that first time, feeling the 777's power and grace, he experienced the same rush of joy he'd felt on his very first solo flight decades ago. His first officer on that trip was a veteran pilot named Marcus Chen, who'd been flying 777s for 15 years. Heard you're the Iceland guy, Chen said once they'd leveled off at cruise. News really never stops traveling in this industry, does it? Nope. But I wanted to say, what you did took guts. A lot of pilots would have stayed in their seats and hoped for the best. You didn't. That matters. Just did what needed doing. That's what good pilots always say. Chen pulled out a thermos of coffee and poured 2 cups. You know what the difference is between flying 767s and 777s? Besides about 100,000 pounds of maximum takeoff weight, Chen laughed. Besides that, the real difference is the 777 makes you lazy if you let it. All these computers want to do the flying for you. The trick is staying sharp enough that when they inevitably fail, you remember how to actually fly. Sounds like you've had some experiences with that. Once or twice. Nothing like Iceland, but enough to keep me humble. Chen sipped his coffee. My advice? Use the automation, but don't trust it. Always have a backup plan. Always know what you'll do if everything goes dark. They flew through the night, crossing time zones and continents, talking about aviation and family and the strange life of always being between places. Chen had been married 3 times, had kids scattered across 2 continents, and spoke about the loneliness of the job with a matter-of-fact acceptance that came from 3 decades of living it. You got anyone waiting for you at home? Chen asked. My daughter. She's 8 now. Lives with me. Just the 2 of you? Her mom left when she was 3. Been just us ever since. That's rough, but also beautiful, in a way. She'll remember that you were there. Malik thought about Nia, probably asleep now in his mother's guest room, dreaming whatever 8-year-olds dream about. I hope so. I'm trying to give her stability while still doing the job I love. It's a balance. It always is. But you know what? The fact that you think about it, that you try to balance it, that makes you better at both. The pilots who just abandon their families aren't good fathers. And usually they're not good pilots either, because they've forgotten what they're flying for. When they landed in Tokyo 20 hours later, Malik was exhausted but satisfied. The flight had been routine in the best way, Smooth operations, good crew coordination, no drama. Just professional aviation done right. Over the following months, Malik settled into a rhythm. He'd fly for 4 or 5 days, then have a week at home with Nia. When he was flying, his mother stayed at the apartment to take care of Nia. When he was home, he made sure to be fully present, helping with homework, making dinners together, taking weekend trips to museums or parks, or anywhere Nia wanted to go. The Iceland lawsuit finally closed completely when Gerald Whitmore's lawyers ran out of appeals. The settlement stood, the airline's legal exposure was contained, and Malik received a formal letter from the company thanking him for his cooperation and professionalism throughout the process. More importantly, the FAA approved the Carter Protocol. The new guidelines established clear procedures for when and how qualified individuals could provide assistance to flight crews during emergencies. It required formal identification, verification of credentials, and explicit authorization from the pilot in command, but it created a legal framework for exactly the kind of help Malik had provided over Iceland. "This will save lives," Margaret Sullivan told him over the phone when the protocol was announced. "The next time a flight crew faces the impossible, they'll have a legal pathway to get help from qualified people instead of struggling alone." That's your legacy, Malik. The 1-year anniversary of the Iceland incident passed quietly. Malik was flying to London when the date came, but he noted it in his logbook with a simple entry: 1 year since Flight 7243. Everyone made it home. That's what matters. Ryan Mitchell, the young first officer from that flight, sent him a message. 1 year ago today, you saved my life and taught me what it means to be a real pilot. Just got my captain upgrade final check ride next week. Thank you for everything." Malik sent back a simple reply. "You saved that flight too. Don't forget that. Good luck on your check ride. You'll do great." Nia's 9th birthday came in February, and this time Malik was home for the whole week. They spent the actual birthday at an indoor skydiving facility, floating in a column of air while instructors taught them how to maneuver. "This is what it feels like to fly!" Nia shouted over the roar of the wind tunnel, her hair whipping around her face, her smile wider than the sky. Malik watched his daughter tumble and spin in the artificial wind, fearless and joyful, and felt something click into place. This was why he'd fought so hard to get back to aviation. Not just because he loved flying, but because he wanted to show his daughter that you could lose everything and build it back. That setbacks weren't endpoints. That doing the right thing mattered even when it cost you. That night, as he tucked her into bed, Nia asked the question he'd been half expecting for months. "Daddy, when I grow up, can I be a pilot like you?" Malik brushed the hair back from her forehead. "You can be anything you want to be, baby girl. If that's a pilot, then yeah, you can absolutely be a pilot. You'd be a great one." "Will you teach me? Every single thing I know?" She smiled and closed her eyes, already drifting towards sleep. "Love you, Daddy." "Love you too, more than all the stars in the sky." 6 months later, Malik was offered a position as a Czech airman, a senior captain responsible for evaluating and training other pilots. It meant less time flying the line and more time in simulators, but it also meant shaping the next generation of aviators. After talking it over with Nia and his mother, he accepted. His first evaluation was with a young first officer going for her captain upgrade. She was nervous, clearly overthinking every procedure, second-guessing herself constantly. "Take a breath," Malik told her before they started the session. "You know this aircraft inside and out. You've studied the procedures until you could recite them in your sleep. The only thing standing between you and success is your own doubt." "But what if I make a mistake?" "Then you'll learn from it. That's what training is for, making mistakes in a safe environment so you don't make them when lives are at stake. I'm not here to fail you. I'm here to help you succeed." She passed the evaluation, and afterwards she thanked him with tears in her eyes. "I've had 5 different Czech airmen over my career, and you're the first one who treated me like a pilot instead of someone who needed to prove they deserved to be here." "That's because you are a pilot. My job is just to verify what you already know." Teaching became Malik's favorite part of the job. He worked with first officers preparing for upgrades, with experienced captains transitioning to new aircraft types, even with struggling pilots who needed remedial training. His approach was always the same: build confidence, emphasize understanding over memorization, Teach pilots to think rather than just follow checklists. One of his students was a former military pilot who'd been involved in a training accident that had shaken his confidence. The pilot had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd failed somehow. "I know that feeling," Malik told him during a break in training. "After my incident with Flight 1847, I carried around this belief that I was somehow deficient as a pilot. It took losing my career and fighting to get it back to realize the truth. I wasn't deficient. I was just human, and being human means making difficult choices that other people might question later." "How did you get past it?" "I stopped trying to get past it. Instead, I accepted it as part of my story. The investigation happened. It was unfair. I lost years of my life to it, but it also taught me things I wouldn't have learned otherwise. And when I finally got back in the cockpit, I was a better pilot because of what I'd been through, not despite it." The student passed his check ride 2 weeks later and sent Malik a bottle of good whiskey with a note. "Thank you for teaching me to be a pilot again." 2 years after the Iceland incident, Malik received an invitation to speak at the International Aviation Safety Conference in Singapore. The keynote address would focus on crew resource management and emergency decision-making, and the organizers wanted him to share his experience. Nia was 10 now, old enough to understand the significance. "You should go," she said when he showed her the invitation. "You should tell everyone what happened. It means being away for a week." "I know, but Grandma will stay with me, and you'll be teaching people how to be safe." "That's important, Daddy." So Malik flew to Singapore and stood in front of 1,200 aviation professionals from 40 countries. He told them about Iceland, about the moment he'd had to choose between regulations and lives, about the cost of that choice and what he'd learned from it. "The question I get asked most often," Malik said near the end of his talk, "is whether I regret entering that cockpit. And the answer is no. Not for a second. Because regulations exist to serve a purpose, keeping people safe. When following a regulation would compromise safety, then following that regulation blindly becomes the real violation." He paused, looking out at the audience. "But here's what I've learned since then. The real courage isn't just in making the hard choice in the moment. It's in standing by that choice afterward when people question it. It's in accepting the consequences while still believing you did the right thing. And it's in using what you learned to make the system better for everyone who comes after you." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, pilots from around the world approached him to share their own stories of impossible choices and difficult decisions. A captain from Japan told him about landing with catastrophic hydraulic failure. An Australian pilot described talking a student through an engine fire. A South African first officer shared her experience with a decompression event that had nearly killed everyone aboard. These were his people, pilots who understood that the job was about more than procedures and checklists. It was about judgment and courage, and the willingness to do whatever it took to bring everyone home safely. 3 years after Iceland, Malik was promoted to chief pilot for the North American cargo operations. It was a management position, which meant even less flying, but it also gave him influence over training programs, safety protocols, and hiring decisions. One of his first acts was to create a mentorship program pairing experienced captains with new first officers. The program was designed to pass down not just technical knowledge, but the kind of practical wisdom that only came from years in the cockpit. "We teach people how to fly," Malik explained to the training department, "but we don't teach them how to be pilots. That's what this program is about, teaching the judgment and decision-making that separates someone who can operate an aircraft from someone who can command one." The program was a success. First officers reported feeling more confident and better prepared for the unpredictable nature of line flying. Captains said the mentoring kept them sharp and reminded them why they'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. Nia turned 12 and started middle school. She joined the school's science club and announced she wanted to study aerospace engineering when she grew up. Malik helped her build a model airplane for the science fair, a simple foam glider that she'd designed herself using principles of aerodynamics he'd taught her. "Daddy, is it hard being a pilot and a dad at the same time?" she asked one evening while they worked on the glider. "Sometimes. I miss a lot of school events. I'm not always here when you need help with homework, but I try to make up for it by being really present when I am here." "You do. You're a good dad. You're a good daughter, best one I could have asked for." She smiled, then went quiet for a moment. "Do you ever think about Mom?" It was a question she'd asked before, but each time it carried new weight as she got older and understood more about what had happened. Sometimes, Malik said honestly, I think about how she left when you needed her most. I think about how much she's missing by not being part of your life. But mostly, I just feel grateful that I get to be your dad. Do you think she ever regrets leaving? I don't know, baby girl. I hope so, for her sake. But whether she does or doesn't, it doesn't change anything for us. We're doing just fine on our own. Better than fine. We're doing great. Yeah, we are. 5 years after Iceland, on a random Tuesday morning, Malik was in his office reviewing training reports when his phone rang. Unknown number, international calling code. This is Captain Carter. Captain Carter, this is Anna Sigurdsson from the Icelandic Transportation Safety Board. We spoke several years ago about the Flight 7243 incident. Malik's pulse quickened. I remember. Is everything all right? More than all right. I'm calling because we've completed our final report on the incident, and I wanted you to hear the conclusions directly before the public release. Our investigation found that the aircraft had multiple undetected maintenance issues that should have been caught during routine inspections. The hydraulic failures were the result of systemic neglect, not crew error or passenger interference. I appreciate you calling to tell me. There's more. The report specifically commends your actions during the emergency. We determined that without your expertise and assistance, the aircraft would likely have crashed with total loss of life. You're being officially recognized for your contribution to aviation safety. Malik had to sit down. After all these years, after all the controversy and investigation and doubt, the official record would finally show the truth. Thank you, he managed to say. That means more than you know. You saved 200 lives that day, Captain, including your own daughters. That's something to be proud of. After the call, Malik sat in his office staring out the window at the aircraft parked on the ramp. 5 years. 5 years of carrying the weight of that night, of wondering if he'd done the right thing, of accepting the consequences while still believing in his choice. Now the official record would show what everyone who'd been there already knew. He'd saved that flight. Not by breaking rules, but by using his knowledge and experience when they were desperately needed. He called Naya, who was at school. She didn't answer, so he left a message. Hey, baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Iceland is officially done. The investigation cleared me, recognized what we did. I love you. See you tonight. That evening, he told her the full story over dinner. She listened with the thoughtful attention of a 12-year-old who was starting to understand the complexity of adult decisions. So you were right all along, she asked. I was right to help. I was wrong to think I could do it without consequences. But yes, ultimately, I was right. I'm proud of you, Daddy. I'm proud of you too. You know why? Why? Because you were 7 years old on the scariest night of your life and you trusted me to keep you safe. That trust, that belief that I could protect you even when everything was falling apart, that's what gave me the courage to step into that cockpit. You made me brave, Nia. She came around the table and hugged him tight. We make each other brave. 6 years after Iceland, Malik was invited to join the FAA's Aviation Rulemaking Committee, focused on emergency procedures and crew resource management. It was a volunteer position, but it meant direct input into the regulations that governed commercial aviation. His first recommendation was to formalize and expand the Carter Protocol, creating clear pathways for qualified individuals to assist during emergencies while maintaining appropriate oversight and safety standards. The committee approved his proposal unanimously. 7 years after Iceland, Ryan Mitchell got hired as a training captain at Atlas Air. His first request was to work under Malik's supervision. You taught me everything important about being a pilot, Ryan said during their first meeting. Not the technical stuff, I learned that in flight school, but the judgment, the courage, the understanding that our job is about people, not just machines. I want to teach that to the next generation. Then let's do it together, Malik said. They became a formidable team, developing training programs that emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, that taught pilots to be prepared for the impossible while hoping they'd never face it. Nia turned 16 and got her student pilot certificate. Malik took her up for her first flying lesson in a small Cessna at a local airport, watching with pride as she took the controls and felt the aircraft respond to her inputs. This is incredible. She shouted over the engine noise, her face lit up with joy. "You're a natural," Malik told her, "just like I knew you would be." They flew for an hour, Malik teaching her the basics of aircraft control, of scanning instruments, of understanding the relationship between pilot and machine. When they landed, Nia's hands were shaking with adrenaline and excitement. "Can we go again tomorrow?" she asked. "We can go as often as you want. I'll teach you everything I know." Over the next 2 years, Malik guided Nia through her flight training. She soloed on her 17th birthday, flying the pattern at a small airport while Malik watched from the ground with his heart in his throat. She passed her private pilot check ride 2 weeks after her 18th birthday, becoming the youngest licensed pilot at their local airport. "I did it, Daddy," she said after the examiner congratulated her. "I'm a pilot." "You sure are, baby girl, and I couldn't be more proud." 10 years after Iceland, Malik was asked to write the foreword for a textbook on aviation safety and emergency decision-making. The book would be used in flight schools across the country, teaching the next generation of pilots how to think critically under pressure. He wrote about Iceland, about the moment he'd had to choose between regulations and lives. But he also wrote about everything that came after: the investigation, the suspension, the fight to reclaim his career. He wrote about learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. "Aviation is built on rules," he wrote in the closing paragraph. "But rules are just frameworks. They guide us, protect us, give us structure. The real art of being a pilot is knowing when to follow those rules absolutely and when to use them as guidelines while you do whatever it takes to bring everyone home. That judgment, that wisdom, is what separates adequate pilots from exceptional ones. And it's something you can't learn from a textbook. You can only learn it by facing impossible situations and choosing to be brave." The book was published on the exact 10th anniversary of the Iceland incident. Malik received a copy in the mail along with a note from the publisher. "Your story will inspire thousands of future pilots. Thank you for your courage and for sharing it." That night, Malik and Nia, now 19 and in her second year studying aerospace engineering at M1T, sat in their apartment looking through old photos from their Iceland trip. The pictures captured a different time, a different version of themselves. Malik saw a man who was still finding his way back to himself. Nia saw a little girl who'd been through something terrifying and come out stronger. "Do you ever think about that night?" Nia asked, "about how close we came?" "Sometimes, but mostly I think about what came after, how we survived it together, how it changed everything." Changed it for the better? Malik thought about his career, about the pilots he'd trained and the lives he'd touched. He thought about the Carter Protocol that had already been used twice to authorize assistance during emergencies. He thought about his daughter, brilliant and brave, studying to build the next generation of aircraft. "Yeah," he said, "for the better." None of it was easy, but all of it mattered. 12 years after Iceland, Malik retired from Atlas Air after a distinguished career. His final flight was from New York to London, the same route he'd flown dozens of times. The crew surprised him with a water cannon salute when they landed, and airport operations arranged for his family to meet him at the aircraft. Nia was there, now a graduate student working on advanced propulsion systems. His mother was there, older but still vibrant. And standing with them was Ryan Mitchell, now a senior training captain himself. "We wanted to see you off properly," Ryan said, shaking Malik's hand. They gathered in the crew lounge for an impromptu celebration. Pilots Malik had trained over the years stopped by to share stories and thank him for his mentorship. The airline presented him with a framed certificate recognizing his contributions to aviation safety and training, but the most meaningful gift came from Nia. She handed him a wrapped package, and when he opened it, he found a model Boeing 767 mounted on a wooden base. A small plaque read, "Flight 7243, Iceland. Everyone made it home." "I had it custom made," Nia explained, "because that's the flight that changed everything. That's the moment you chose to be brave, and it made all the difference." Malik held the model carefully, remembering that night over the Atlantic, remembering the fear and the determination, remembering the choice that had cost him so much but had also given him everything. "Thank you, baby girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is perfect." That evening, after the celebrations had ended and everyone had gone home, Malik stood at his apartment window one last time watching aircraft approach LaGuardia. He'd spent 40 years in aviation, from his first solo in an Air Force trainer to his final landing as an airline captain. He'd flown through storms and clear skies, through triumph and disaster, through moments of pure terror and moments of transcendent joy. He'd made mistakes. He'd faced consequences. He'd been broken and had put himself back together. He'd lost his career and fought to reclaim it. He'd saved lives and been punished for it, then vindicated years later. But through it all, he'd never stopped being a pilot. Even during the years in the warehouse, even during the suspension, even in the moments when everything seemed lost, he'd remained who he was at his core, a pilot, a father, a man who believed that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Naya. "Love you, Dad. Thank you for showing me that courage means standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. That's the best lesson anyone could learn." Malik smiled and typed back, "Love you too. And thank you for being the reason I found my courage in the first place. Everything I did for you." He put his phone away and took one last look at the aircraft passing overhead, their lights blinking steady against the night sky. Somewhere up there, pilots he'd trained were flying their routes, making decisions, keeping people safe. The legacy of that night over Iceland lived on in every pilot who'd learned from his experience, in every emergency procedure that had been improved, in every life that would be saved because the system had gotten a little bit better. Malik Carter had started as a man who'd lost everything. He'd become a man who'd fought for everything. And he'd ended as a man who'd given everything he had to make aviation safer for everyone who came after him. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.